Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Whispers. I'm aware that many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if each of you could leave a comment letting me know which part of the world you're listening from. Also, give a like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Okay, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. It was my first teaching job after college. Fresh out of school, with big dreams of molding young minds, I'd landed a position at Pine Grove Elementary in rural Maine. The school was exactly what you'd expect: a weathered red brick building with creaky wooden floors and windows that rattled when the winter wind blew. I started in September 1957, taking over Mrs. Henderson's third grade class after she retired. The first few months were wonderful. My students were bright and eager to learn, their parents were supportive, and I felt like I'd found my calling. Every morning, 24 smiling faces would greet me, ready for another day of learning. I knew each child's personality by heart: Tommy with his endless questions about science, Sarah, who loved to write stories, Michael, who struggled with math but tried so hard. Then came winter break. When classes resumed in January, something felt different. I noticed it first with Emily Matthews. She'd always been one of my most talkative students, constantly raising her hand to participate. But that Monday morning, she just sat there, staring straight ahead with glassy eyes. When I called on her, she answered in a flat voice that made the hair on my neck stand up. "The circle grows wider," she said, though I'd asked her about multiplication tables. I brushed it off as post-holiday blues. Kids sometimes took time to readjust after breaks. But over the next few days, more students began acting strangely. Their artwork during free period changed too. Where there used to be houses and puppies and family portraits, now every single child drew the same thing: a spiral symbol with what looked like teeth around the edges. When I asked about their drawings, they'd all give the same answer: "It's what we see when we close our eyes." During parent-teacher conferences that week, I tried bringing up these changes. Mrs. Matthews sat across from my desk, wearing the same vacant expression as her daughter. "Emily is fine," she said mechanically. "The circle grows wider. We are all fine." Every parent said the exact same thing, word for word. Their voices were empty, like recordings played through an old radio. Even Mr. Johnson, who used to argue about every little thing, just repeated those phrases with dead eyes. By the end of January, half my class had changed. The normal kids started avoiding the others, huddling together during recess. I overheard whispered conversations. "Danny's not Danny anymore. Sarah stopped breathing during math yesterday. I watched her for 10 whole minutes. They know things they shouldn't know." I started documenting everything, taking photos of the artwork, writing down the strange things my students said. One morning, Tommy, still himself then, tugged my sleeve during reading time. "Miss Wilson," he whispered, "watch what happens when you say the Pledge of Allegiance." I did. The changed children spoke in perfect unison, their voices overlapping in a way that made my skin crawl. But they weren't saying the pledge. They were reciting names and dates, hundreds of them, dates that hadn't happened yet. I tried talking to the principal, but Mr. Crawford just smiled that same empty smile and said, "The circle grows wider. We are all fine." By February, only 5 of my original students remained. The others, they looked the same, but everything else about them was wrong. They moved in sync. They knew things they couldn't possibly know. During a lesson about the Civil War, they all turned to look at me at exactly the same moment and began describing, in perfect detail, how I'd died in a car accident last summer. But I hadn't died. I was right there. That's when I started noticing other things around town. The way people at the grocery store all reached for items in perfect unison. How the Sunday church service had become a monotone chant of names and dates. The strange symbols appearing on buildings overnight. the same spiral my students kept drawing. Last week, Tommy, my last unchanged student, didn't come to school. When I called his house, his mother answered with that familiar empty voice. The circle grows wider. We are all fine. I'm writing this now because I know I don't have much time left. This morning, I found one of those spiral symbols drawn on my front door in what looks like red chalk. My students are all staring at me as I write this, their heads tilted at identical angles. They've been perfectly still for 20 minutes, just watching. They're starting to stand up now, moving as one. Their mouths are opening, but the sounds coming out, those aren't children's voices anymore. I can hear footsteps in the hall, the same synchronized footsteps I've been hearing around town more and more lately. The door is opening. Parents, teachers, townspeople, they're all here, all smiling that same empty smile. The circle grows wider, they're saying. Your turn, Miss Wilson. I know now why Mrs. Henderson really retired. If you're reading this, stay away from Pine Grove. The children here, they're not children anymore. And whatever is wearing their faces is spreading. I can feel it starting already, that cold emptiness creeping in. This morning, I caught myself drawing that spiral symbol without meaning to. The circle grows wider. We are all fine. The journal ends here, found in an abandoned classroom at Pine Grove Elementary School. Margaret Wilson was reported missing in March 1957. The school closed permanently in 1960 after the unexplained disappearance of 87 residents in the span of 3 years. Local records show a recurring spiral symbol appeared throughout the town before each disappearance. To this day, visitors to Pine Grove report seeing children in 1950s clothing walking in perfect unison through the empty streets, all speaking in voices that sound nothing like children. If you think the nightmare is over, think again. The next story will leave you speechless. The first time I noticed something was wrong at the Maple Street open house was when Mrs. Henderson walked through the front door. Nothing unusual about that. She was right on time for her 2000 p.m. viewing. The strange part was that I distinctly remembered showing her the same house 3 hours earlier. "Welcome to 247 Maple Street," I said automatically, but my smile felt frozen. Mrs. Henderson just beamed at me, like we'd never met. "Oh, what a lovely entryway," she exclaimed, running her hand along the dark wood banister, the same gesture she'd made that morning. "I'm Robert Myers, and I've been selling houses in suburban Connecticut for nearly 20 years. You don't last that long in real estate without developing good instincts." Something about this situation made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Mrs. Henderson," I started carefully, "didn't we already tour the house this morning?" She looked at me blankly. "No, dear, this is my first time here, though I must say, it already feels familiar somehow." I checked my appointment book. The 11:00 a.m. slot was empty, but I could picture her there clear as day, same beige sweater, same pearl necklace, same sensible shoes. "My mistake," I said smoothly. "Shall we begin the tour?" The house was a classic colonial revival. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, original hardwood floors throughout. I'd shown it dozens of times since listing it 3 months ago. The owners had moved out west suddenly, leaving it fully furnished. Perfect for showing. We started in the living room, with its bay windows overlooking the front yard's maple trees. Mrs. Henderson made all the same comments she had that morning about the crown molding, the window seats, the brick fireplace, word for word. My stomach started to knot as we moved into the dining room. The heavy mahogany table still had place settings laid out, like the family had just stepped away from dinner. But something was different. I could have sworn there were 4 place settings that morning. Now there were 5. "Oh, what a lovely china cabinet," Mrs. Henderson exclaimed, moving toward it. The same words she'd used before. But this time when she reached for the glass doors, I grabbed her wrist. "Let's check out the kitchen," I said quickly. Her skin felt cold under my fingers. The kitchen was wrong too. The layout was the same. Granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, breakfast nook with a view of the backyard. But the wallpaper had changed from pale yellow to a deep burgundy. And there was a door next to the pantry that I'd never seen before. "What's through there?" Mrs. Henderson asked, reaching for the handle. "Storage," I said sharply. But I knew that door hadn't been there during any previous showing. My heart was pounding now. We headed upstairs. The master bedroom was exactly as I remembered. King-sized bed still made with expensive linens, his and hers walk-in closets, ensuite bathroom with a jacuzzi tub. But when I turned around, Mrs. Henderson was gone. "Mrs. Henderson?" My voice echoed strangely in the empty room. I found her in the guest bedroom, standing motionless in the center of the room. But something was wrong with her posture, too stiff, head tilted at an odd angle. "Mrs. Henderson?" She turned slowly. Her face was blue, eyes bulging, a thin cord around her neck. Before I could scream, she vanished. I ran for the stairs, but they didn't lead to the foyer anymore. Instead, I found myself in a long hallway I'd never seen before. Family photos lined the walls, faces I didn't recognize, except there I was, in pictures I'd never taken, standing in rooms I'd never been in. The hallway seemed to stretch forever. I started running, passing door after door. Behind one, I heard sobbing. Behind another, screaming. I threw one open and saw Mr. Patterson, a client from last week, hanging from the ceiling fan. Another revealed the Williams family from yesterday's showing, huddled in a corner as black mold crept across their skin. My phone was dead. My watch had stopped. The windows showed nothing but darkness, though it had been mid-afternoon moments ago. I ran downstairs, but the front door was gone, just smooth wall where it should have been. The dining room table now had 12 place settings. Each plate held what looked like ashes. In the kitchen, that strange door stood open, revealing stairs leading down into blackness. The burgundy wallpaper was moving, patterns swirling like living things. I heard the front door open, heard my own voice saying, "Welcome to 247 Maple Street." I ran toward the sound, but instead of the foyer, I found myself in the master bathroom. My reflection in the mirror was wrong. My face was decades older, decaying. That's when I remembered. The first time I showed this house 3 months ago. The owners hadn't moved west. They'd vanished. Just like the family before them. Just like every family that had ever lived here. I've been showing this house for 50 years now. Each viewing reveals new rooms, new horrors. Sometimes I see other agents giving tours, their faces familiar but wrong, like photographs left in the sun too long. Sometimes I catch glimpses of myself leading groups through rooms that shouldn't exist. The house keeps growing. New wings appear daily, spiraling off into impossible directions. I've found rooms filled with nothing but mirrors, reflecting empty chairs. Staircases that loop back on themselves endlessly. Closets that lead to vast, dark spaces where something breathes in the shadows. Mrs. Henderson comes every day at 2:00 p.m. Sometimes she's alive. Sometimes she's not. Sometimes she's something in between. I keep showing her the house because I have to. Because I'm starting to remember that first showing, 3 months or 50 years ago, when I followed a strange door into the basement and never really came back up. If you're house hunting in suburban Connecticut, you might see a listing for 247 Maple Street. Classic colonial revival, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, original hardwood floors throughout. The photos will look perfect. The price will seem too good to be true. Don't schedule a viewing. Don't come to the open house. And if you see me standing in the doorway, wearing my best realtor smile, run. Run before you find yourself giving tours of rooms that never end to people who died decades ago in a house that's hungry for more. But you'll probably come anyway. They always do. And I'll be here to show you around. After all, I'm a professional. And this house is always open. You might want to check behind you, because the next story will make you feel like you're being watched. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as I pushed my cleaning cart down the empty hallway of Denver General Hospital. It was 11:45 p.m., just the start of another graveyard shift. I'd been working here for about 6 months, and while the night shift wasn't exactly exciting, it paid the bills. That night, in September 1985, started like any other. I checked in with Nancy, the night nurse at the front desk, who always had a kind smile despite the bags under her eyes. We chatted briefly about the Broncos game while I signed my paperwork. Looking back now, I wish I had noticed how tired she looked, how her hair seemed grayer than usual. My first task was always cleaning the East Wing, starting from room 301 and working my way down. I remembered Mrs. Twumph. Martinez was in 301. Sweet old lady, always thanked me for keeping her room tidy. But when I opened the door, I found Mr. Peterson sleeping there instead. Strange. I could have sworn Mrs. Martinez was there just yesterday. I checked my clipboard. Sure enough, it showed Mr. Peterson had been in 301 for the past week. Must be my memory playing tricks on me, I thought. Working nights can do that to you. As I moved down the hall, more things felt off. Room 304 had different charts than I remembered from yesterday. Room 307's patient had somehow moved to 312. I started double-checking everything, convinced I was losing my mind. Then I noticed something about Dr. Roberts when he passed by. Just last week, he'd been telling me about his daughter's high school graduation, but the man who walked past me looked at least 10 years older. Deep wrinkles around his eyes. Salt and pepper hair that I swore had been mostly black days ago. The morgue was always my least favorite part of rounds, but it had to be done. As I wheeled my cart down to the basement, the temperature seemed to drop with every step. The old service elevator creaked and groaned, its dim light flickering as it descended. I had a routine in the morgue, quick cleanup, no lingering. But that night, something made me stop and count the occupied drawers. 15 bodies, according to the log. I counted again, 12. I checked the release forms. No bodies had been moved. Where did 3 bodies go? Over the next few weeks, I started keeping careful notes. The numbers never added up. Bodies would vanish without paperwork. Staff members aged before my eyes. Nancy's kind smile became framed by deeper wrinkles each night. The new intern, Dr. Chen, went from fresh-faced to silver-haired in what felt like days. One night, I caught a glimpse of something in the morgue's security mirror. The air behind me seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. But the morgue was always ice-cold. As I watched, the ripple moved closer to one of the body drawers. The metal handle turned by itself. I ran. By the time I reached the elevator, my heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. When the doors opened, I found myself face to face with Nancy. She looked ancient, her once brown hair now completely white, her face a map of wrinkles. "James," she whispered, her voice cracking. "How long have you worked here?" 6 months, I answered automatically. She shook her head slowly. "Check your employee badge." I looked down at my ID card. The issue date read 1980, 5 years ago. But that couldn't be right. I'd just started in spring, hadn't I? That's when I noticed my reflection in the elevator's metal wall. My own face looked back at me, but not the face I remembered. Gray streaks ran through my hair. Crow's feet crept from the corners of my eyes. I looked like I'd aged a decade. I quit that night, left my cart in the hallway, and never went back. But sometimes, I drive past Denver General at night. Through the windows, I see the lights flickering, and I swear I can make out figures moving in the darkness, figures that seem to age and wither as they walk the halls. The hospital is still there, still operating. New staff members come and go, always looking a little older than they should. And sometimes, when I read the obituaries, I notice former employees who seem to have died decades before their time. I've tried telling people about what happened there, but who would believe me? All I know is that time moves differently in those halls at night. The hospital feeds on it, stealing years from the living and the dead alike. Every time I look in the mirror and see another gray hair, I wonder, did I really get away, or did it take a piece of my time too? Nancy still works there, according to an old colleague. She's been on the night shift for about 5 years, just like she was when I left, just like she was when I started, just like she'll probably always be, counting down the hours in halls where time itself goes to die. Just when you thought it was safe to breathe, the next tale will steal it away. The brass key felt heavy in my palm as I stood before Grandma Marshall's diner. The once cheerful red and white awning now hung limp in the humid Georgia air, gathering dust since Grandma's passing 3 weeks ago. The lawyer had handed me the keys yesterday, along with a stack of paperwork declaring me the sole owner of the family business. I hadn't planned on returning to Baker's Mill after college, but here I was, 24 years old, and inheriting the most popular diner in 3 counties. The place had been serving its famous meat pies since my great-grandmother's time, and the recipe had been passed down through generations of Marshall women. The bell chimed as I pushed open the door, stirring memories of childhood afternoons spent watching Grandma work her magic in the kitchen. The familiar scent of herbs and spices still lingered in the air. Everything looked exactly as she'd left it. The checkered tablecloths, the row of pie displays, even her ancient recipe book still sitting on the counter. I spent that first day cleaning, trying to ignore the constant stream of people pressing their faces against the windows. Locals had been coming by daily, asking when we'd reopen. They seemed different somehow, more intense than I remembered. Their eyes had a hungry gleam that made me uncomfortable. "Linda! Linda Marshall!" A sharp rapping on the glass made me jump. It was Mrs. Peterson from the post office. "When are you starting up the pies again, dear? We're all waiting." I waved politely but didn't answer. Something about her smile seemed off too wide, too desperate. By sunset, I'd had 15 similar visitors, all asking specifically about the meat pies. That evening, I decided to check Grandma's recipes to see what made them so special. The old leather-bound book was full of her neat handwriting, but as I flipped through the pages, something fell out. A small brass key, similar to the one for the front door. It took me an hour of searching to find the lock it fit. Behind the pantry shelves, hidden by decades of stored cans and boxes, was a door I'd never noticed. The key turned with a rusty click, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The basement wasn't on any of the building plans I'd received. My phone's flashlight revealed walls lined with dozens of journals, each dated and carefully arranged. The oldest was from 1918, written by my great-grandmother. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it to a random page. April 15, 1918, used the traveling salesman today. Tender meat, though the suit made him harder to process. Customers noticed the improved flavor immediately. Mrs. White asked for seconds. My hands trembled as I grabbed another journal, this one from 1962. September 3, the Dixon boy was getting too curious about our methods. He'll serve a better purpose in tomorrow's batch. The whole town came for a taste. Journal after journal told the same story. My family had been feeding Baker's Mill its own citizens for over a century. The missing persons reports I remembered from childhood newspapers suddenly took on a horrifying new meaning. A loud bang upstairs made me drop the journal. Footsteps crossed the diner floor above. "Linda?" Mrs. Peterson's voice called out. "We saw your light on. Is the kitchen ready yet?" "We're so hungry, dear, so very hungry." More voices joined hers. I could hear them gathering outside the diner, their murmurs growing louder, more insistent. The bell above the door chimed. "The pies, Linda. We need the pies." Their footsteps crossed the floor above, spreading out, searching. They knew every inch of this place. They'd been coming here their whole lives, drawn back again and again by meat pies made from their own neighbors, their own families. I'm writing this from the basement, where I've barricaded myself in. They're still up there, more of them now. I can hear them in the kitchen, pulling out pots and pans, calling my name. The worst part is the hunger in their voices. They know what they've been eating all these years. They know, and they don't care. The lights just went out. I can hear them coming down the stairs. They're so hungry. The darkness hides many secrets, and the next story reveals one you'll never forget. The desert counter. My job as a census worker for the Bureau wasn't exactly thrilling, but it paid the bills. Driving through New Mexico's endless desert highways, clipboard in hand, I'd visit the scattered towns and settlements that most people never knew existed. It was simple work: knock on doors, count heads, document demographics. At least that's how it started. I remember the exact moment things began feeling wrong. It was a scorching July afternoon when I pulled into Martinez, a tiny spot on the map with maybe 24 buildings total. The first house I visited belonged to an elderly woman who smiled warmly and answered all my questions. Nothing unusual there, but when I asked how many people lived in town, she didn't hesitate. 157 souls here in Martinez, same as always. I thanked her and moved on. The next house, a middle-aged couple gave me the same number, 157. House after house, person after person, they all said the same thing with the same certainty. I checked my records from previous years. 157 residents, unchanged for decades. That night in my motel room, I pulled out my laptop and started digging through old census records. What I found made my stomach turn. Every remote settlement I'd visited in the past month had exactly 157 residents. Towns triple the size of Martinez, towns half its size, all 157 people. No more, no less. I told myself it had to be a glitch in the system. The next morning, I drove to Sandoval, a desert town about 50 miles east. The first person I interviewed, a teenage boy working at the gas station, gave me that number again before I even asked. 157 people here in Sandoval, mister. Always has been. My hands started shaking as I made my notes. The boy kept talking, describing how his grandfather helped found the town in 1943. His story matched perfectly with the official records, but something felt rehearsed about it. When I asked follow-up questions, he'd repeat the same phrases word for word, like an actor who only knew certain lines. Over the next few days, I visited 6 more towns, every single one, 157 residents. But it got stranger. People in each town shared identical memories about their community's history. They used the same phrases, told the same stories, even laughed at the same points in their tales. Only their faces were different. I started comparing my maps with older versions. Towns that should have been 20 miles apart were now separated by 50. Some appeared in completely different counties from one map to the next. It was like the settlements were moving across the desert, but nobody seemed to notice except me. Late one night, I was updating my files when I found a restricted folder buried in the census database. Most of it was encrypted, but I managed to open a few documents. They contained phrases like Population Management Initiative and Community Stability Protocol. One memo mentioned maintaining optimal resident count for social cohesion studies. The next morning, my supervisor called. His voice was friendly, but something about it made my skin crawl. He said they were transferring me to a different region, effective immediately. When I tried to ask questions, he just kept repeating himself in that same pleasant tone, using the exact same words, like the people in those towns. I'm writing this from a motel in Arizona. My key card says room 157. The front desk clerk told me they have exactly 157 rooms, even though I can only count 40 doors in this single-story building. Through my window, I can see a man in a dark suit walking across the parking lot. He's carrying a clipboard. I've typed up everything I've found and stored it in different places online. If you're reading this, it means I finally got the courage to share it. But I have to be careful. They're watching the numbers. They're always watching the numbers. Last week, I drove back to Martinez. The town was gone. just empty desert where buildings used to stand. But when I checked the latest census data that night, there it was. Martinez, New Mexico. Population 157. I don't know what they're doing out here in the desert. I don't know why they need that specific number or why they keep moving these towns like pieces on a game board. But I do know one thing. I've started counting the people in my neighborhood back home. Yesterday there were 158 residents. This morning I watched a moving truck arrive next door. My new neighbors should be here any minute now. I'm not going to stay to meet them. I'm not going to stay to watch someone leave either. Because I know tomorrow, no matter what happens tonight, there will be exactly 157 people living on my street. The numbers don't lie, but sometimes I wish they would. Think you've heard it all? This next story will prove you wrong. The last letter from Camp Pine Lake. Looking back, I should have noticed something was wrong on my very first day as a counselor at Camp Pine Lake. The other staff members seemed normal enough. They smiled, made small talk, helped me settle in. But there was something off about their eyes. They never quite met mine when we spoke about the campers. I'd taken the summer job because I needed the money for college, and being a camp counselor seemed like an easy gig. Growing up in Minnesota, I'd been to plenty of summer camps myself. The familiar smell of pine needles and lake water brought back good memories as I drove up to the old wooden welcome sign. The camp director, Mr. Harrison, was a tall man with silver hair who spoke in whispers even when we were alone in his office. As he handed me the cabin assignments, his fingers were ice cold despite the July heat. "You'll be in charge of cabin 7, he said. 8 wonderful children. They've been coming here for quite some time. That first week felt normal enough. We did all the usual camp activities, swimming, crafts, campfire songs. The kids in my cabin were well behaved, if oddly quiet. They never fought or complained like typical 12-year-olds. They moved together in perfect sync during activities, as if they'd rehearsed every motion. It was during mail call that I first felt that deep, gnawing wrongness. Every other cabin had kids jumping up and down, eager for letters from home. But cabin 7 just sat there, staring ahead with empty smiles. No letters ever came for them. "Don't their parents write?" I asked Sarah, another counselor who'd been there the previous summer. "Oh, their families are very busy," she said, that same strange smile playing across her lips. "But the children don't mind. They have each other." The lake started changing about 2 weeks in. At first it was subtle, just a deeper blue than usual. Then patches of inky blackness began spreading from the deeper parts. I brought it up during a staff meeting, but everyone acted like they couldn't see it. The really strange thing was how my kids reacted to the water. They became obsessed with drinking it, refusing the bottled water I offered. They'd cup their hands and drink straight from the lake, giggling as the dark water dribbled down their chins. When I tried to stop them, they just stared at me with those empty smiles. "The deep ones say it's good for us," Jenny told me one night as I tucked her into bed. "They say it helps us stay." "The deep ones?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "They live in the lake," she whispered. "They've always been here, since 1922, when the first children came." All 7 other kids nodded in perfect unison, their eyes reflecting the moonlight like mirrors. That's when I started digging through the camp records. In Mr. Harrison's office, I found registration forms going back decades. As I flipped through them, my blood ran cold. The signatures of the parents were identical, not similar but exactly the same, down to every curve and dot. And the names of the children. I found Jenny's form from 1988, and 1975, and 1952. Same child, same age, same sweet smile in the photo. All my cabin 7 kids were there, unchanged, decade after decade. They caught me in the office. Mr. Harrison and the other counselors surrounded me, still wearing those pleasant smiles. "We hoped you'd work out," he sighed. "The children liked you." But now, I ran. Somehow, I made it to my car and drove away that night. I never went back, never reported it. Who would believe me? But sometimes, on summer nights, I dream about those children. They're still there, drinking that black lake water, waiting for the next counselor. Their families never write because they have no families. They haven't since 1922, when they first came to Camp Pine Lake, and sometimes, when I pass lakes with particularly dark water, I swear I can hear them giggling. Every shadow has a story, and the next one might be the most horrifying yet. The night shift at Blackwood Manor Apartments started like any other. I'd been working security there for about 3 weeks, keeping an eye on the massive renovation project. The building was this gorgeous old thing from the 1920s, all dark brick and ornate stonework, but it needed serious updating. Management had cleared out all the tenants for the work, which meant my job was pretty straightforward: make my rounds, check for break-ins, and make sure nothing caught fire. That particular Thursday in October, I arrived at 11 p.m. as usual. Mike, the day guard, handed me the logbook and keys. "All quiet today, Will. Just contractors coming and going." They finished gutting the east wing on 7. He yawned and grabbed his coat. "See you tomorrow." I settled into the security desk in the lobby, pulling out my thermos of coffee. The renovation crew had left the grand entrance mostly untouched. Crystal chandeliers caught the dim emergency lights, casting strange shadows across marble floors. Wind whistled through plastic sheeting covering broken windows, making them ripple like dark waves. Around 1 a.m., I started my first round. The elevator was shut down for maintenance, so I took the stairs. Everything looked normal on the first few floors: dusty floors, exposed wiring, stacks of building materials. But when I reached the 4th floor, something felt off. The blueprints showed 4 apartments per floor, arranged in a cross pattern. But as I walked the hallway, counting doors, I found 5. Then 6. I stopped, confused, and pulled out the floor plan again. The extra doors shouldn't exist. I tried one, locked. The next one opened into a wall of fresh drywall. I blamed it on tired eyes and too much coffee. But then I heard humming coming from somewhere down the hall. A woman's voice, soft and melodic, like an old lullaby. "Hello?" I called out. "This building's closed for renovation. You can't be here." The humming stopped. Footsteps echoed, moving away. I followed the sound, but the hallway seemed longer than it should be. The emergency lights flickered, and for a moment, I saw wallpaper on the walls, faded floral patterns from decades ago, before they returned to bare concrete. My radio crackled. Through the static, I heard what sounded like an old-time radio show, then Mike's voice. "Will, you there? Had a break-in reported on 7 back in 55. Need backup." The transmission cut off, but Mike wasn't working, and this wasn't 1955. I checked my watch, 1:15 a.m. I decided to head up to 7, just to be sure. Each floor I passed felt different. On 5, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and big band music played faintly. 6 smelled of fresh paint, like it had just been renovated. But not in 2024. More like 1960. When I reached 7, my watch read 1:15 a.m. Still, the minute hand hadn't moved. The East Wing hallway stretched out before me, but it wasn't gutted like Mike had said. It looked perfectly maintained, frozen in time. A newspaper lay outside one door, the headline about Kennedy's election victory. A black rotary phone sat on a hallway table, its cord trailing into the wall. That's when I found the logbook. Not my logbook, but an old one, wedged behind a radiator. The entries spanned decades. October 12, 1955, Guard Thompson missing after investigating noise complaint on 7. March 3, 1967, Guard Martinez failed to check out, last seen on 4. September 15, 1982, Guard Chen reported time discrepancies between floors, transferred next day. The entries went on. Different guards, different decades, but similar stories. Some mentioned extra doors appearing. Others reported hearing past events playing out. Many simply vanished. My radio crackled again. This time I heard voices overlapping, guards from different eras, all making their reports, all still echoing through the building. I tried calling dispatch, but my phone showed no signal. I checked my watch again, 1:15 a.m. I'd been on the 7th floor for at least 20 minutes, but time wasn't moving. Or maybe it was moving differently up here. Something moved at the end of the hall. A figure in an old security uniform walked through a wall like it was a door. Before it vanished, it turned and I saw my own face, aged about 20 years. I ran, down the stairs, through time periods that bled into each other. On 4, a 1940s couple walked through me laughing. On 3, I heard children playing kids who'd lived here in the 70s. On 2, renovations from the 90s were somehow still in progress. I burst into the lobby at 1:16 a.m. 1 minute had passed down here. My hands shook as I wrote my report, trying to make sense of it all. But what could I write? That the building existed in multiple times at once? That past guards were still making their rounds somewhere in those twisted halls? I quit the next day. But sometimes I dream about those halls, stretching into impossible geometries. I dream about my older self, still walking the 7th floor. And I wonder, in some version of the building, am I still there? Are we all still there, all the guards who ever walked those halls, trapped in our own minutes that never end? The renovation was never completed. The building was demolished last year. But sometimes, driving past the empty lot at night, I see lights in windows that no longer exist, and my watch always stops at 1:15 a.m. But the night is far from over. Our next story will show you why. The first thing I noticed was wrong that Sunday morning was the smell. Churches have a particular scent, old wood, dusty hymnals, and lingering traces of Wednesday night potlucks. But that morning in 1969, St. Matthew's Baptist smelled like wet copper and soil. I'd been the reverend there for nearly 2 decades, watching our little congregation grow from 30 faithful souls to almost 100. Every face was familiar to me. The Hendersons with their 5 children always filling the 3rd row, Mrs. Patterson who never missed a service despite her arthritis, and young Tommy Weber who played the organ. That morning, though, something felt different as I prepared for the early service. The air was thick despite the cool autumn weather. As I arranged my sermon notes on the pulpit, I noticed the usual creaks and groans of our old church building seemed more pronounced. The wooden pews appeared darker, somehow, as if they'd aged overnight. Sarah, our secretary, poked her head in through the side door. "Reverend Miller, the first congregants are arriving." Her voice wavered slightly. "But something's not right." I followed her outside to greet the members as they arrived, like I did every Sunday. The Hendersons were first, as always, but when they walked past me, something made me shiver. Their clothes were right, their smiles were right, but their eyes seemed empty. I blessed them and watched as they took their usual seats. More families arrived, and with each one, that feeling of wrongness grew stronger. I kept counting heads, a habit from years of ministry, but the numbers weren't adding up. We had exactly 97 members, but I'd already counted over 100 people entering, and they were still coming. During the first hymn, I noticed extra verses appearing in the hymnals, words about sacrifice and darkness that I'd never seen before, yet everyone sang them as if they'd known them all their lives. Mrs. Patterson's voice rang out clear and strong, which was impossible because I'd visited her in the hospital just yesterday after her stroke. The sermon felt wrong in my mouth. My carefully prepared words about faith and community twisted themselves into something else. I spoke of depths and shadows, of multiplication and eternal service. The congregation nodded along, their faces rapt with attention. Between the early and late services, I always walked through the sanctuary to straighten the prayer books and collect forgotten bulletins. That Sunday, I counted the pews. We'd always had 20 rows on each side. Now there were 25. I counted again, 27. I turned away for a moment, and when I looked back, there were 30 rows stretching into shadows that shouldn't have existed in our sunlit church. The late service began, and I saw the same people enter again. The exact same people, wearing the same clothes, taking the same seats, except they were already sitting there. I watched in horror as 3 Mrs. Pattersons sang in the choir, while 2 more sat in their usual spot near the front. During the offering, I noticed the door to the basement was open. We only used it for storage and the occasional potluck. But now I could hear singing coming from below. our hymns, but distorted, like they were being sung underwater. I walked down the stairs, each step taking me deeper than our single-story basement should have allowed. The steps kept going. 10 steps, 20, 50, 100. The singing grew louder, and I began to see pews arranged in the darkness. They were filled with my congregation, hundreds of copies of them, all singing, all staring forward with those empty eyes. The Hendersons sat in perfect rows, multiplied dozens of times. Countless Mrs. Pattersons raised their voices in an endless hymn. I turned and ran back up the stairs, but they seemed to multiply beneath my feet. When I finally reached the main floor, the sanctuary was empty. The pews had multiplied again, stretching back into impossible darkness. On the altar, my Bible lay open to a page that hadn't been there before, filled with words I couldn't read, but somehow understood, about a hunger that could only be satisfied by endless multiplication, by copies of souls. Sarah found me there the next morning, clutching my Bible. She said I was babbling about duplicate congregations and infinite basements. The church looked normal in the Monday morning light, 20 rows of pews on each side, just like always. But I couldn't shake what I'd seen. I resigned that week, but I still drive past St. Matthew's sometimes. Every Sunday, the parking lot is full, though the church registry shows the same 97 members. Through the windows, I can see the pews stretching back into darkness that shouldn't be there, and I hear the hymns, so many voices singing the same song, over and over and over. The congregation is still growing, though they never seem to get any new members, and sometimes, late at night, I see multiple Mrs. Pattersons walking into the grocery store, or 3 sets of the Henderson family at the gas station. I try to tell myself it's just my imagination, but I know better. Whatever started that Sunday is still spreading, still multiplying, still hungry. Last week, I saw myself walking into the church. I was wearing my old preaching suit and carrying my Bible. But I never went near that building. I know I didn't. At least, this version of me didn't. The scariest part? What's coming next might just be worse. It started as a simple commission, like any other restoration job I'd done before. As a professional portrait artist in Portland, I often got calls to touch up old family paintings. The Blackwood estate reached out to me in late October 1991, asking if I could restore their collection of family portraits. The pay was excellent, maybe too good to be true, looking back. The mansion sat at the edge of Forest Park, partially hidden behind towering Douglas firs. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, a thin woman with sharp features, led me through rooms filled with antique furniture to a long gallery lined with portraits. 8 paintings hung there, depicting what she said were generations of Blackwoods. They've been in quite poor condition lately, she explained, her voice oddly flat. The paint seems to be deteriorating. I noticed what she meant immediately. The portraits had an unusual texture. The paint appeared to be running slightly, as if melting. The faces looked somewhat blurred, their features less defined than they should be. It was unlike any deterioration I'd seen before in my 15 years of restoration work. I can start tomorrow, I told her, already planning my approach. It should take about 2 weeks to restore them all. That first day went normally enough. I began with the oldest portrait, a stern-looking man from the 1850s named Theodore Blackwood. The paint responded well to my initial cleaning, though it felt strangely warm under my fingers. By evening, I'd made good progress rebuilding the lost details of his face. The next morning, something felt off. Standing before Theodore's portrait, I froze. His head position had shifted slightly. I was certain he had been looking straight ahead yesterday. But now his eyes seemed to be gazing toward the door. I checked my photos from the previous day, but they were too blurry to tell for sure. I tried to shake it off as a trick of memory, but similar things kept happening. Each morning, the portraits looked subtly different from how I'd left them. A hand moved lower. A smile grew wider. Eyes followed me across the room. I started taking detailed notes and precise photographs, trying to prove to myself I wasn't imagining things. Then I noticed the smell. At first, it was so faint I barely registered it, a metallic tang that reminded me of copper. It seemed to come from the paintings themselves, especially when I was working closely on them. The odor grew stronger as days passed, until it was unmistakable. The paintings smelled like blood. One afternoon, while working on Caroline Blackwood's portrait from 1923, my brush slipped and scraped the surface. The paint didn't flake off as old oil paint should. Instead, it welled up like a fresh wound, red and wet. I jerked back, dropping my brush. The paint dripped down the canvas, leaving a dark trail. I started paying more attention to the current Blackwood family members when they'd check on my progress. Eleanor's face was changing, becoming more and more like her grandmother Caroline's portrait. Her daughter Julia's features were slowly morphing to match her great-aunt's painting. It wasn't just age or family resemblance. They were transforming into exact copies. While cleaning the frame of Thomas Blackwood's portrait from 1892, I found something tucked into the backing, a newspaper clipping from 1893. It detailed the mysterious disappearance of the entire Blackwood family that spring. The article mentioned rumors of dark rituals and included a photo of the family. They looked nothing like the people in the portraits. My hands shook as I read further. Every few decades, the pattern repeated. A family would vanish, then new Blackwoods would appear, claiming to be distant relatives. But the portraits remained constant. They weren't paintings of the original family. They were something else. Something that needed new faces, new lives, to sustain itself. Last night, I made the mistake of staying late to finish Eleanor's great-grandfather's portrait. As the sun set, the temperature in the gallery dropped. The copper smell became overwhelming. In the dying light, I saw the portraits change. The faces turned to look at me, really look at me. Their eyes no longer painted, but somehow alive and hungry. I ran, and I'm never going back. But I can't stop thinking about what I saw in those final moments, how the figures seemed to be pressing against their canvas prisons, how their fingers left trails of red as they clawed at the boundaries of their frames. Most of all, I can't forget Eleanor's face when I first met her, compared to how it looks now, almost completely absorbed into her grandmother's portrait, both of them watching me with the same painted smile. I've tried reporting it to the police, but who would believe me? The Blackwoods still host parties, still appear in local society pages. If you look closely at the photos, though, you'll notice how flat their faces appear, how their eyes seem to be painted on. Sometimes I think about the real family, the original Blackwoods. Are they trapped in those portraits, looking out through oil paint eyes? Or did the portraits consume them completely, using their essence to fuel whatever dark purpose keeps them aging, changing, hunting? I've given up portrait work entirely. I can't trust paintings anymore, not when I know what they can hide. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can smell copper in the air, and I wonder if the portraits are looking for me. After all, they still need a new face every few decades, and I've seen too much to be allowed to walk away. You may want to keep the lights on for this one. It's darker than you'd expect. It started about 3 months after I bought Miller's Meats on the south side of Chicago. The previous owner, old Frank Miller, practically gave the place away. I should have known something was off when he sold a successful family business for a fraction of its worth. But I was too excited about finally owning my own butcher shop to question my good fortune. The first strange thing I noticed was with the meat itself. I'd wrap up the day's leftover cuts and store them in the walk-in freezer, only to find them looking fresher the next morning. At first I thought I was imagining things. Maybe the fluorescent lighting was playing tricks on my eyes, or perhaps I was just getting better at preserving the meat. But then I started paying closer attention. One night, I deliberately left a slightly discolored piece of beef in the freezer. The next morning, it had the rich, red color of fresh-cut meat. I checked the temperature controls, thinking maybe they were malfunctioning, but everything was working normally. The really unsettling part began when I noticed the organization of the meat changing overnight. I'm meticulous about my work. Every cut has its place. But some mornings, I'd come in to find things had shifted. Not knocked over or messy, but rearranged. Almost like the pieces were trying to fit together again. Then came Mrs. Rodriguez's story. She'd been buying meat from the shop for years, even before I took over. One day, she told me how the roast she'd bought had helped heal her husband's stomach ulcers. I laughed it off, but more customers started sharing similar stories. Mr. Chen's arthritis improved. Little Tommy's asthma cleared up. All of them regular customers who bought meat at least twice a week. I started researching the shop's history. Miller's Meats had been there since 1977. But before Frank Miller, there was another owner. And before that, another. Each one had disappeared mysteriously, leaving the shop to be sold to the next person. The building itself dated back to the 1800s. The local library had old newspapers on microfilm. I spent hours going through them until I found something that made my blood run cold. The land where the shop stood had once been a ritual site for a Native American tribe. They believed the ground had healing properties, but there was a price for using its power. One night, I decided to stay late and see what really happened after hours. I hid in my office, leaving the door cracked open with a clear view of the freezer. Around midnight, I heard it, a low, pulsing hum coming from the walk-in. The temperature gauge started fluctuating wildly. Through the freezer's clouded window, I saw movement. The meat was shifting. Pieces were sliding across the shelves, connecting with other pieces. I watched, paralyzed, as they formed patterns, almost like they were trying to reconstruct themselves into whole animals. The humming grew louder, and I felt a vibration coming up through the floor. The air became thick and heavy, carrying a metallic taste that reminded me of blood. That's when I noticed my old knee injury wasn't hurting anymore, an injury I'd had for 20 years. I should have left right then. Should have sold the shop like Frank Miller did. But I couldn't. The meat was calling to me, promising to make me whole in ways I'd never imagined. Each night, I watched the ritual repeat. Each morning, I sold the meat to my customers, knowing it was changing them too. Last week, I found an old journal hidden behind some loose bricks in the basement. It was Frank Miller's. The final entry read, "The land gives life, but it needs life in return. The meat brings healing, but someone must feed the source. My time is coming. I've chosen my replacement well. I'm writing this now because I can feel it starting, the same pull that took the others. The freezer calls to me every night, its hum growing louder, more insistent. My body feels stronger than it has in years, but I know it's just preparing me. For what? I'm not sure. The shop will be up for sale soon. The price will be surprisingly low. Someone will think they're getting a bargain, just like I did. They'll notice the meat stays unusually fresh, and their customers will start feeling better. The cycle will continue. If you're reading this, and you're thinking about buying a butcher shop in Chicago, particularly one with a suspicious history and an unusually low price tag, take my advice. Walk away. Some deals are too good to be true, and some prices are higher than money can measure. The humming is getting louder now. The freezer door just opened on its own. I think it's time. If you thought you couldn't be more afraid, wait until you hear what happens next. I never wanted to tell this story, but I think it's time. My hands are shaking as I type this, even though it's been decades since that autumn in 1957. I was 13 then, living in the quiet suburb of Maple Hills, Connecticut. What happened during my paper route still haunts me. Sometimes I wake up at 4:30 a.m., right when I used to start my route, and I can still feel that creeping sensation of being watched. It started simple enough. My friend Bobby moved away that summer, and his paper route opened up. The money seemed good, $2 a week plus tips, and I figured it would help me save up for the new Schwinn bicycle I wanted. Mom wasn't keen on me being out so early, but Dad said it would build character. "Tommy," he'd said, "a paper route teaches responsibility, makes a man out of you." If he'd known what was waiting for me in those pre-dawn hours, he never would have let me near that route. The first week went fine. I'd wake up at 4:30, load up my canvas bag with the Connecticut Herald, and pedal through the silent streets of our neighborhood. There were 42 houses on my route, spread across Maple, Oak, and Pine streets. I had a system: hit the east side first while the sun was coming up, then loop back through the west side. The only tricky part was old Mrs. Henderson's house. She wanted her paper exactly 3 feet from her front door, no closer, no further. It was during my second week that I noticed something odd. At the Petersons' house, my 20th stop, their paper wasn't where I'd left it the day before. Instead, I found it carefully placed in their mailbox. Strange, since Mr. Peterson always wanted it on his welcome mat. The next day, same thing at the Clark's house. The paper moved from their porch to their mailbox. I mentioned it to Dad over breakfast. He suggested maybe the homeowners were moving them themselves, but something felt wrong. These papers weren't just moved, they were placed exactly the same way, at the same angle, in each mailbox. Then I started noticing other things. Bike tire tracks in the morning dew, following my exact route. The sound of a chain clicking, always just far enough behind me that when I turned around, I'd see nothing but shadows. One morning, I found a Herald from 3 months ago, crumpled and weathered, with Bobby's delivery mark on it. The paper was dated the day before he moved away. My curiosity got the better of me. I started asking around about Bobby, but nobody seemed to remember exactly when he'd left or where he'd gone. Even his house stood empty, for sale sign swaying in the autumn wind. The real estate agent told me the family had moved suddenly, leaving most of their furniture behind. The library's microfiche archives showed something even more disturbing. Every 3 years, going back to 1927, a paper boy had disappeared from Maple Hills. The articles were small, tucked away on back pages, missing children who were assumed to have run away. The most recent was Bobby Thompson, my friend who'd moved away. Before him was Danny Miller in 1954, Peter Walsh in 1951. The list went on. I should have quit right then. Should have told my parents, the police, anyone. But 13-year-old boys don't always make smart choices. Instead, I decided to catch whoever was following me. That's when I met Mr. Harrison. He lived in the blue house on the corner of Pine Street, a Korean War veteran who always paid his paper bill on time and left me good tips at Christmas. One morning, he was outside at 5 a.m., tending to his garden. Strange hour for gardening, but he explained he couldn't sleep much since the war. "Say, Tommy," he called out as I tossed his paper, "you ever notice anything strange on your route?" The way he asked it made my stomach turn. His eyes seemed too bright in the pre-dawn darkness. "Sometimes," I admitted, "like someone following me." He nodded slowly. "War taught me about following people, tracking them. You learn to walk exactly where they walk, match their patterns." His voice had changed, becoming flat and distant. "Sometimes, late at night, I still hear them, the footsteps of the enemy, always following. But now I'm the one who follows." I pedaled away as fast as I could. That night, I snuck into Dad's study and used his typewriter to make a list of every missing paper boy. 30 years, 10 boys, all disappeared between September and November, all on the same route I now carried. The next morning, I left home early, 4 a.m. instead of 4:30. The streets were darker than usual, street lights casting long shadows across empty lawns. I made my first few stops quickly, rushing through my route. At the Petersons' house, I heard it, the soft click of a bicycle chain behind me. I turned around. Nothing but darkness. But when I reached Mrs. Henderson's house, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A bicycle, just like mine, leaning against her fence. And next to it, examining a newspaper with a flashlight, was Mr. Harrison. He looked up slowly, and in the beam of his flashlight, I saw something worse than any monster. I saw recognition, understanding, the look of a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. "Right on time, Tommy," he said softly. "Just like the others. So predictable, so easy to follow." I didn't think. I just pedaled. Behind me, I heard the squeak of his bicycle chain, the soft whir of tires on asphalt. He was following my exact path, matching my every turn. Even when I went off route, cutting through yards and alleys I'd never used before, I could hear him behind me. The sun was starting to rise when I made it to Main Street. My lungs were burning, legs aching from pedaling so hard. I looked back one last time. Mr. Harrison was gone. But something else caught my eye, movement in his garage as I passed his house. The door was partially open. Bicycles, dozens of them, hanging from the ceiling like bizarre trophies. Some new, some rusted with age. I recognized Bobby's red Schwinn right away. And there, in the corner, a stack of paper route records dating back to 1927. I never delivered another paper. Dad found my bicycle the next morning, abandoned at the corner of Maple and Oak, my canvas bag still full of undelivered heralds. The police searched Mr. Harrison's house, but they found nothing. No bicycles, no records, no evidence at all. He'd cleaned everything out overnight and disappeared. They did find something else, though, when they dug up his garden. Something that answered the question of what happened to all those missing paper boys. But that's not my story to tell. I'm 65 now, living 3 states away, but I still get the Connecticut Herald delivered. Every morning, I check to make sure it's on my welcome mat, exactly where the carrier left it. And every so often, I find it carefully placed in my mailbox instead. On those mornings, I close my curtains and wait for the sun to rise. Sometimes, if I listen carefully, I can hear the soft click of a bicycle chain in the distance, following a route that never seems to end. Local newspapers from 1957 confirmed the disappearance of Thomas Wilson Jr.'s bicycle on October 15th. Police records show Gerald Harrison, 45, was never located for questioning. Between 1927 and 1957, 10 paper boys disappeared from the same route in Maple Hills. Their cases remain unsolved. The Connecticut Herald discontinued youth paper carriers in the area in 1958. To this day, residents of Maple Hills occasionally report hearing the sound of bicycle chains in the pre-dawn hours, though no one is ever seen. Some stories creep under your skin, but this next one, it stays there. The letter about Uncle Henry's death arrived on a Tuesday. I remember because Tommy had just started first grade, and I was still getting used to the quiet house during school hours. The envelope sat unopened on my kitchen table for 3 days, just another reminder of how alone we'd been since David's accident last year. When I finally opened it, I expected the usual condolences. Instead, I learned that my reclusive uncle had left me his farmhouse in Montana. The same uncle who'd stopped answering family calls 5 years ago. The same weathered Victorian I'd spent summers in as a child, back when the paint wasn't peeling and the garden was still alive. "It's perfect timing," my mother said over the phone. "You and Tommy need a fresh start, Catherine. And heaven knows teaching jobs are easier to find in small towns." She wasn't wrong. My substitute position at the elementary school barely covered rent, and Tommy still cried for his dad at night. Maybe a change of scenery would help us both heal. The drive from Seattle took 14 hours. Tommy slept through most of it, clutching the teddy bear that still smelled faintly of David's aftershave. When we finally turned onto the gravel driveway, the setting sun cast long shadows through the surrounding pine trees. The house loomed ahead of us, 3 stories of faded yellow siding and sagging shutters. "It looks sad," Tommy said, pressing his face against the car window. "It just needs some love," I replied, trying to sound cheerful, like a big hug. The realtor had left the keys under the mat, along with a thick envelope of paperwork. The front door creaked open into a musty foyer. Everything was exactly as I remembered. The carved banister curling up to the second floor, the heavy brass chandelier, the floor-to-mouth mirror that had always given me the creeps as a kid. "Can I pick my room?" Tommy asked, already halfway up the stairs. "Be careful," I called after him. "Some of the floorboards might be loose." While Tommy explored upstairs, I walked through the first floor. The furniture was all covered in white sheets, like ghosts frozen in mid-conversation. In the kitchen, dishes were still stacked in the drying rack. Uncle Henry's coffee mug sat unwashed by the sink, a brown ring staining its bottom. The police report had been vague. They'd found him in the basement after neighbors reported not seeing him for weeks. Natural causes, they said. But something about the house felt wrong. The air was too still, the shadows too deep. That first night, we camped out in the living room with sleeping bags and flashlights. Tommy made shadow puppets on the wall while I read through Uncle Henry's papers. Most were typical house documents, but one caught my eye, the original blueprints from 1892. The architect's name was circled in red ink, Marcus Blackwood. I pulled out my phone and Googled him. The first result made my blood run cold. Frontier architect revealed as serial killer, 1893. According to the article, Marcus Blackwood had designed several homes across Montana Territory in the early 1890s. After his arrest, police discovered he'd built hidden passages into the walls, spaces where he could spy on residents, move unseen through the houses, and eventually. I closed the browser, feeling sick. "Mommy?" Tommy's voice was small. "Who's the man in the walls?" I dropped my phone. "What man, sweetie?" "The one who watches me when I'm upstairs. He comes out of the wall next to the closet." I told myself he was just imagining things. He'd been having nightmares since David died. But that night, after Tommy finally fell asleep, I heard it. Soft scraping sounds inside the walls, like someone dragging something heavy. I convinced myself it was just the house settling. Old houses make noise. But over the next few weeks, things kept happening that were harder to explain. Every morning, furniture would be slightly moved, a chair pulled out, a picture frame tilted. I'd close all the doors before bed, only to find them open in the morning. Tommy started refusing to sleep in his room, saying the man in the walls kept trying to talk to him. "He's sad," Tommy told me one morning over breakfast. "He says Uncle Henry wasn't nice to him." I started researching the house's history. Marcus Blackwood had built it for his sister, but she'd died before moving in. Since then, it had passed through several owners. Many had reported strange occurrences, missing items, unexplained noises, cold spots. 3 families had moved out within months, and then there were the disappearances. In 1923, a young maid vanished without a trace. In 1947, a traveling salesman was last seen approaching the house. In 1958, a local teenager went missing after delivering groceries. The police had searched the property each time, but found nothing. I started noticing other things too. The walls seemed thicker in some places than others. Sometimes I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, like someone ducking around a corner. The mirror in the foyer would show reflections of rooms that didn't match what was behind me. One night, I woke to Tommy's screaming. I ran to the living room where he'd been sleeping and found him pointing at the wall. "He tried to take me," Tommy sobbed. "He came out and tried to grab me." The wallpaper was disturbed, a long tear running from floor to ceiling. When I touched it, I felt cool air flowing from behind it. The next day, I called a contractor. He found the first passage behind Tommy's closet, a narrow space between the walls, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It connected to a network of hidden corridors that honeycombed the entire house. "These weren't on any blueprints," the contractor said, shining his flashlight into the darkness. "Someone added them later." We found the second passage behind the kitchen pantry. The third was accessed through a false panel in the library. Each one was lined with strange scratches, like someone or something had been trying to claw their way out. Then we found the basement door. Not the main cellar entrance, but a hidden door tucked behind the furnace. It was sealed with heavy padlocks, all new. "Those aren't original," the contractor said. "Someone put these on recently." I remembered Uncle Henry's last letter to my mother, rambling about noises in the walls, about someone watching him. Everyone thought he was becoming paranoid in his old age. Now I wondered if he'd known something. The locksmith came the next day. When the door finally swung open, the smell hit us: first decay and old copper. The flashlight beam revealed a circular room that wasn't on any blueprint. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves, I sent Tommy to the neighbor's house before the police arrived. They worked through the night, removing the bodies. 6 in total, in various states of preservation. Uncle Henry was the most recent, propped up in a corner like a grotesque display. The others were older, much older. Each one had been carefully preserved, positioned like dolls at a tea party. In Uncle Henry's office, they found journals dating back months. He'd discovered the passages by accident while renovating. Then he'd started hearing things: footsteps, whispers, scratching in the walls. He'd set up cameras, installed locks. The last entry was dated 3 days before his death. It's not Blackwood. It was never Blackwood. The house built the passages. The house wants them. It's so hungry. We moved out that week, leaving everything behind. The house still stands, empty now, except for the occasional real estate agent trying to sell it. Every few years another family moves in. They never stay long. Tommy's 12 now, but he still wakes up screaming sometimes. He says he dreams about the man in the walls, about narrow passages that go on forever, about rooms that shouldn't exist. He says the house is still hungry. I dream too, about Uncle Henry's face in that basement room, about the scratches on the walls, about what might have made them. But mostly, I dream about the mirror in the foyer. In my dreams, I see myself reflected in it, but I'm not alone. There's always someone standing behind me, smiling, reaching out with long, pale fingers. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder about those passages. Not the ones we found, but the ones we didn't. I wonder if they're still there, winding through the walls like veins in a living thing. I wonder if they're growing. Last month, another family disappeared from the house. The police searched those passages again, but found nothing. Just empty spaces between the walls, getting wider every year, like a mouth slowly opening. I still have the key to the front door. Sometimes I think about going back, about finding the truth behind those walls. But then I remember Uncle Henry's last words. The house wants them. And I wonder, what does it want them for? The house is for sale again. The listing describes it as a charming Victorian with original details, perfect for a growing family. The price drops every month, but no one stays long enough to unpack. At night, neighbors say they see lights moving behind the windows, hear scratching in the walls. They say if you stand across the street at sunset, you can see faces in the upstairs windows, faces that don't belong to anyone living in the house. They say the walls are thicker now, the rooms smaller. They say the house is waiting. But waiting for what? Sometimes I drive past it, just to make sure it's still there. It looks different each time. The windows seem to have moved. The angles are wrong. The shadows fall in impossible directions. But the mirror in the foyer never changes. It still hangs there, reflecting things that aren't there, showing truths that shouldn't exist. And sometimes, if you look closely, you can see something moving in that reflection, something that lives in the spaces between the walls, in the dark places where the passages twist and turn, something that's been there since long before Marcus Blackwood drew his blueprints, before the first nail was hammered, before the foundation was laid, something that's still hungry. If you're house hunting in Montana, you might see a listing for a yellow Victorian on Pine Creek Road. The price will seem too good to be true. The realtor will talk about original hardwood floors, about crown molding and bay windows, about how much house you get for your money. But if you go inside, pay attention to the walls. Notice how thick they are, how the shadows move when you're not looking. Listen for scratching sounds late at night, for whispers in empty rooms. And whatever you do, don't look too long in that foyer mirror, because the house is always watching, always waiting, always hungry. And the walls are getting thicker every day. What if I told you things could get even more unsettling? Let me prove it. There's something unsettling about being alone in a department store at night. The emptiness of a place meant to be full of people. The way mannequins cast long shadows in the dim emergency lights. the gentle hum of the ventilation system that somehow makes the silence even deeper. After 6 months of working the night shift at Miller's department store in downtown Chicago, I thought I'd gotten used to it all. I was wrong. I took the job in June of 1975, fresh out of high school and desperate for work that didn't involve fast food. Miller's was a Chicago institution, one of those grand old department stores with gleaming brass fixtures and elaborate window displays. During the day, it was elegant, all polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers. But at night, it transformed into something else entirely. My shift started at 10 p.m., right after the cleaning crew finished up. I'd walk through all 8 floors, checking locks and making sure everything was secure. The store had an old-fashioned punch clock system. I had to insert my time card at various stations throughout the building to prove I'd made my rounds. The first few months were uneventful. Sometimes I'd find a stray customer's umbrella or watch the rats scurrying in the alley behind the loading dock. The worst part was the boredom. I'd bring books to read between rounds, sitting at the security desk near the employee entrance. That changed one night in early October. I was making my usual rounds, starting from the top floor and working my way down. The 8th floor was home goods, beds, linens, furniture. As I walked past the bedroom displays, something caught my eye. One of the mannequins in the master bedroom setup seemed wrong. I'd walked past this display 100 times before. The scene showed a woman sitting at a vanity table, brushing her hair, while a man stood by the window reading a newspaper. But tonight, the woman was facing the wrong way. Instead of looking in the mirror, she was turned toward the room, her blank face pointed directly at where I stood. My first thought was that the display team must have rearranged things during the day, but why would they make such a small, pointless change? I made a note in my logbook and continued my rounds. The next night, she was back in her original position. I felt silly for having been unsettled. But as I turned to leave, movement caught my eye in the mirror's reflection. I spun around, nothing had changed. The mannequins stood motionless in their eternal tableau. I hurried through the rest of my rounds. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing more discrepancies. Mannequins throughout the store seemed to be slightly out of place each night. A hand raised instead of lowered. A head turned a few degrees. A stance shifted. I began photographing the displays at the start of my shift and comparing them to how they looked at the end. The changes were subtle but undeniable. I tried talking to the display team during shift changes. They insisted they hadn't touched most of the mannequins in weeks. Too busy with the holiday displays, they said. When I showed them my photos, they laughed it off. Probably just the vibrations from the L train, one suggested. These old buildings settle all the time, but it wasn't just the mannequins. Items would move between my rounds, a chair pushed out from a table, a book open that I distinctly remembered closing. One night, I found a pearl necklace shattered on the floor beneath a jewelry counter, the pearls scattered in a perfect spiral pattern. I started spending my breaks in the store's archives, hoping to find some explanation. Miller's kept meticulous records going back to its opening in 1892. As I dug through yellowing employee files, a pattern emerged. Every few years, a night watchman would disappear. The official records listed them as terminated, no notice given or resigned, personal reasons. But there were no final paychecks issued, no forwarding addresses listed. The most recent was Thomas Kelly, my predecessor. According to his file, he'd worked at Miller's for 8 years before vanishing in May, just before I was hired. His emergency contact information led to a disconnected phone number. I dug deeper into the archives. News clippings from the 1940s mentioned a night watchman found dead in the elevator shaft, ruled an accident. In 1963, another disappeared, leaving nothing but his flashlight on the 4th floor. The police report suggested he'd simply walked off the job. But the most disturbing discovery came when I found an old storage inventory from 1955. It listed the store's mannequin collection, 342 pieces. The current inventory showed 418. Where had the extra mannequins come from? The purchase records showed no major acquisitions. As I studied the photographs in my logbook, I began to notice something else: the faces of the mannequins. They weren't all the same generic molds you'd expect. Some had distinctive features: a crooked nose, a slight asymmetry to the eyes, a unique curve to the lips. They looked almost individual. One night in late November, I was making my 2 a.m. rounds when the power went out. This wasn't unusual. Chicago's electrical grid was notoriously unreliable in the 70s. I reached for my flashlight, but it was dead. Strange, I'd just changed the batteries. The emergency lights cast a sickly green glow through the store. As my eyes adjusted, I realized I was on the 4th floor, women's wear. Dozens of mannequins surrounded me, their shadows stretching and distorting in the dim light. That's when I heard it, the soft sound of plastic sliding against plastic, like someone slowly dragging their hand across a mannequin's surface. Then another sound joined it, and another, a chorus of subtle movements in the darkness. I turned toward the noise and froze. In the green emergency lighting, I could have sworn I saw one of the mannequins move. Not the subtle shifts I'd documented before. Its arm was reaching toward me. As I watched, paralyzed, its head turned. The blank eyes seemed to fix on mine. Then another moved, and another. The sound grew louder, that horrible plastic scraping. I backed away, bumping into something solid. I spun around and found myself face to face with a mannequin I didn't recognize. Its features were different, more detailed, more real. The face was contorted in an expression of terror. I ran. I don't remember much about getting out of the store. I know I dropped my logbook somewhere on the 3rd floor. I remember the sound of footsteps behind me. Not the hollow click of plastic feet, but real footsteps, running. I remember the blast of cold air when I burst out of the employee entrance, and the way my hands shook so badly I could barely start my car. I never went back to Miller's, never even returned to collect my last paycheck. The next day, I called in sick. The day after that, I mailed them my resignation letter. They tried calling a few times, but I let it ring. A week later, I worked up the courage to drive past the store during the day. Everything looked normal, shoppers coming and going, elaborate Christmas displays in the windows. But something caught my eye in the 3rd floor window. A new mannequin had been added to the display. Its face was turned toward the street, and even from below, I could see its features clearly. It was Thomas Kelly. Not a perfect replica, the nose was too smooth, the chin too sharp, but unmistakably him. I'd seen his photo enough times in the employee files to know. Miller's department store closed in 1983. The building still stands, converted into luxury condos. Sometimes I walk past it late at night, when the streets are empty. The windows are different now. The display spaces turned into living rooms and bedrooms. But sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of movement behind the glass. A figure standing too still, too perfect, watching. I've never told this story before. Who would believe me? But last week, I saw something that compelled me to write it down. I was reading the Tribune's real estate section. They're renovating the Miller's building again. During demolition, they found something in a sealed room on the 4th floor. The article mentioned multiple mannequins discovered in unusual condition. The police are involved now. They're not saying much, but I've heard rumors. The mannequins aren't hollow plastic. They're trying to identify the remains. And somewhere in that building, in some forgotten corner or sealed room, my logbook still exists. The photos are still there, documenting those subtle changes night after night. Documenting the truth about Miller's, about the mannequins, about all those missing night watchmen. I've thought about coming forward, telling the police what I know. But what would I say? That the mannequins moved? That the store was somehow collecting people? That old Mr. Miller, who died in 1972, had found a way to preserve more than just his business. So I keep my silence. But every time I pass a department store window, every time I see a mannequin's blank stare, I wonder how many of them were once like me. How many were just doing their job, working the night shift, until they became part of the display. And sometimes, late at night, I dream of that green emergency lighting, of plastic hands reaching out, of footsteps running behind me. In those dreams, I don't make it to the exit. Instead, I join the silent watchers in the window, my face frozen in an eternal scream, waiting for the next night watchmen to make their rounds. The renovation crews are working at night now. I've seen their lights on in the upper floors. Last night, I drove past and saw a figure standing in one of the fourth-floor windows. It wasn't moving, just watching. As I passed, I could have sworn it raised its hand, beckoning. I wonder if they're hiring any night watchmen. As the clock ticks closer to midnight, the stories only get darker, like this one. It was the garage door that first caught my attention. Every morning at exactly 8 a.m., I'd hear it open and close, followed by the familiar sound of Sarah Wilson's blue Honda Civic pulling out of the driveway next door. The thing is, Sarah Wilson had been declared legally dead 3 months ago. I've lived on Maple Street in suburban Portland for 15 years. It's the kind of neighborhood where everyone knows each other, or at least they used to. Things started changing last year when Robert Wilson moved in next door with his wife Sarah. They seemed normal enough at first. Robert worked from home as a medical equipment salesman, while Sarah taught third grade at the local elementary school. The first sign that something was wrong came in early October. I was tending to my garden when I heard screaming from their house. Not the kind of scream you'd hear from someone watching a scary movie or being startled. This was different, raw, desperate. By the time the police arrived, Robert was calm and collected. He explained that Sarah had left after an argument, taking only her car and purse. The police filed a missing persons report, but weeks turned into months with no sign of her. That should have been the end of it. But every morning, like clockwork, I'd hear that garage door open, the car start up and drive away. At first, I thought I was imagining things. I even started recording the times in a notebook to make sure I wasn't going crazy. 8:00 a.m. every single day. My bedroom window faces their house, and sometimes late at night, I'd see lights on in their basement. Strange shadows would move across the tiny window wells. Once, I could have sworn I heard Sarah's voice calling out, but it was muffled, distorted, like someone trying to speak underwater. The smell started in December. At first, it was subtle, something metallic and sweet, that would drift across my yard on warm days. My dog Max would go crazy whenever the wind blew it our way, barking and whining at their basement windows. Robert explained it away as a plumbing issue when other neighbors complained. But there was something about the way he smiled that made my skin crawl. I started watching more closely after that. Robert's routine never changed. He'd leave for groceries every Wednesday at 6 p.m., returning exactly an hour later with 2 large bags. The strange thing was, I never saw him take out any garbage. Not once in 3 months. One night in January, during a power outage, I heard something that still haunts me. The backup generators hadn't kicked in yet, and the street was pitch black. That's when I heard it, a mechanical whirring sound coming from their basement, followed by what sounded like muffled sobs. The power came back on moments later, but those few seconds of darkness changed everything. Whatever was happening in that house, it needed constant power to continue. I tried telling the police my suspicions, but they'd already investigated Robert thoroughly when Sarah first disappeared. Without evidence, they couldn't get a warrant. And Robert? He just kept smiling that empty smile whenever we crossed paths, asking about my garden or commenting on the weather as if everything was normal. The breaking point came in March. I was in my backyard when I heard a crash from their basement window well. A small object had fallen through the gap between the window and the frame. It took me a few minutes to work up the courage to check what it was. When I finally did, my blood ran cold. It was a woman's finger, with a familiar turquoise ring still attached, the same ring I'd seen Sarah wearing countless times. That night, I did something I'm not proud of. While Robert was on his weekly grocery run, I broke into their garage. The Honda was there, pristine as ever, with a sophisticated timer attached to the garage door opener. But it was what I found in the trunk that made me realize the true horror of the situation. A detailed schedule, written in Robert's precise handwriting. Monday, left arm preservative solution, thous. Tuesday, right leg below knee temperature control critical. Wednesday, resupply day. nutrient mix, painkillers, antibiotics. Thursday, torso maintenance check vitals hourly. Friday, right arm prepare preservation tank force. Saturday, left leg above knee adjust life support accordingly. Sunday, rest day, minimum maintenance only. The list went on and on, with detailed notes about keeping the subject conscious and maximum tissue preservation. That's when I heard the garage door opening. Robert was back early. I barely made it out in time, hiding behind my own garage as he pulled in. As he unloaded his groceries, I noticed they weren't grocery bags at all, but medical supply containers. The same kind you'd see in a hospital. The next morning, the garage door opened at 8 a.m. sharp, but this time, I was ready with my phone, recording. The Honda pulled out as usual, turned right at the corner, and then, nothing. 20 minutes later, it pulled back into the garage. No driver, just an empty car on an automated schedule, maintaining a horrible facade of normalcy. I'm writing this now because I need someone to know the truth. The police are coming tomorrow with a warrant. They finally found something in Robert's medical supply orders that raised red flags. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. I can still hear Sarah. Not just her voice, but different parts of her, crying out from that basement. Some nights, it's a scream from what sounds like the east corner, while simultaneously, whimpers come from the west. As if she's somehow everywhere and nowhere at once. The Honda still runs its daily route, even though Robert was arrested this morning. The police searched the house for hours, but found nothing, no body, no evidence, just empty medical equipment and a basement full of preservation tanks. They're calling off the search tomorrow, but I know she's down there, somewhere, in pieces, but alive. The sounds from the basement have changed since they took Robert away. They're not screams anymore, but something worse, a kind of rhythmic tapping coming from different corners of the basement, like multiple hands drumming out the same desperate pattern. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can make out words in that tapping. The same message, over and over. I'm still here. All of me, still here. The garage door just opened again. It's 3 a.m. The car is pulling out. But this time, I heard laughing coming from inside it. Sarah's laugh. From everywhere at once. I'm moving tomorrow. Every step deeper into the night reveals another horror. The next one is waiting for you. The desert counter. My job as a census worker for the Bureau wasn't exactly thrilling, but it paid the bills. Driving through New Mexico's endless desert highways, clipboard in hand, I'd visit the scattered towns and settlements that most people never knew existed. It was simple work, knock on doors, count heads, document demographics. At least that's how it started. I remember the exact moment things began feeling wrong. It was a scorching July afternoon when I pulled into Martinez, a tiny spot on the map with maybe 24 buildings total. The first house I visited belonged to an elderly woman who smiled warmly and answered all my questions. Nothing unusual there, but when I asked how many people lived in town, she didn't hesitate. 157 souls here in Martinez, same as always. I thanked her and moved on. The next house, a middle-aged couple gave me the same number, 157. House after house, person after person, they all said the same thing with the same certainty. I checked my records from previous years, 157 residents, unchanged for decades. That night in my motel room, I pulled out my laptop and started digging through old census records. What I found made my stomach turn. Every remote settlement I'd visited in the past month had exactly 157 residents. Towns triple the size of Martinez, towns half its size, all 157 people, no more, no less. I told myself it had to be a glitch in the system. The next morning, I drove to Sandoval, a desert town about 50 miles east. The first person I interviewed, a teenage boy working at the gas station, gave me that number again before I even asked. 157 people here in Sandoval, mister. Always has been. My hands started shaking as I made my notes. The boy kept talking, describing how his grandfather helped found the town in 1943. His story matched perfectly with the official records, but something felt rehearsed about it. When I asked follow-up questions, he'd repeat the same phrases word for word, like an actor who only knew certain lines. Over the next few days, I visited 6 more towns. Every single one. 157 residents. But it got stranger. People in each town shared identical memories about their community's history. They used the same phrases, told the same stories, even laughed at the same points in their tales. Only their faces were different. I started comparing my maps with older versions. Towns that should have been 20 miles apart were now separated by 50. Some appeared in completely different counties from one map to the next. It was like the settlements were moving across the desert, but nobody seemed to notice except me. Late one night, I was updating my files when I found a restricted folder buried in the census database. Most of it was encrypted, but I managed to open a few documents. They contained phrases like Population Management Initiative and Community Stability Protocol. One memo mentioned maintaining optimal resident count for social cohesion studies. The next morning, my supervisor called. His voice was friendly, but something about it made my skin crawl. He said they were transferring me to a different region, effective immediately. When I tried to ask questions, he just kept repeating himself in that same pleasant tone, using the exact same words, like the people in those towns. I'm writing this from a motel in Arizona. My keycard says room 157. The front desk clerk told me they have exactly 157 rooms, even though I can only count 40 doors in this single-story building. Through my window, I can see a man in a dark suit walking across the parking lot. He's carrying a clipboard. I've typed up everything I've found and stored it in different places online. If you're reading this, it means I finally got the courage to share it, but I have to be careful. They're watching the numbers. They're always watching the numbers. Last week, I drove back to Martinez. The town was gone, just empty desert where buildings used to stand. But when I checked the latest census data that night, there it was, Martinez, New Mexico. Population 157. I don't know what they're doing out here in the desert. I don't know why they need that specific number or why they keep moving these towns like pieces on a game board. But I do know one thing. I've started counting the people in my neighborhood back home. Yesterday, there were 158 residents. This morning, I watched a moving truck arrive next door. My new neighbors should be here any minute now. I'm not going to stay to meet them. I'm not going to stay to watch someone leave either. Because I know tomorrow, no matter what happens tonight, there will be exactly 157 people living on my street. The numbers don't lie, but sometimes I wish they would. You think the worst has passed, but sometimes the scariest part is what's still to come. The worst part about being a mail carrier in rural Texas isn't the heat, or the long drives between houses, or even the occasional aggressive dog. It's the silence. The kind of silence that lets your mind wander to dark places, especially when you start noticing things that don't add up. My name is Betty Williams, and I've been delivering mail in Cryer County for 23 years. The route I'm about to tell you about was my first back in 1991. These days, I drive a different route in a different county. Sometimes I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about what happened that summer in Cryer County. It started with the Hendersons' mail. Simple thing, really. Their mailbox was getting full. Now, this wasn't unusual. People go on vacation, especially during summer. But the Hendersons never went anywhere. Martha Henderson had arthritis so bad she could barely walk to the mailbox, and John hadn't left their property since his stroke in '89. Every day, I'd watch their mail pile up a little more. After a week, I started getting worried. The protocol is to hold mail after 10 days if no one collects it. But out here in rural areas, we mail carriers often serve as unofficial watchdogs for our residents. On day 8, I pulled up their long dirt driveway. The house looked normal at first glance. White paint peeling in the Texas sun, old pickup truck in the driveway, Martha's wind chimes tinkling in the hot breeze. But something felt wrong. The silence was different. Usually, you'd hear their ancient window unit air conditioner rattling, or their old dog Blue barking. Now there was nothing. I knocked on the door. No answer. Peeked through the windows. The furniture was there, dishes in the sink, TV guide open on the coffee table. But no people, no dog. Just empty rooms filled with evening sunlight and dust motes floating in the air. That's when I noticed the symbol on their mailbox. I hadn't seen it that morning when I delivered their mail, but there it was, carved into the metal, fresh enough that silver showed through the black paint. It looked like a circle with strange markings inside, almost like a compass rose, but wrong somehow. The angles didn't make sense, and looking at it too long made my head hurt. I called the sheriff's office from my truck radio. Deputy Randy Hawkins came out, took a look around, and said he'd file a report. But something in his eyes didn't sit right with me. He wrote everything down too fast, barely looked at the house, and kept glancing at that symbol on the mailbox. Probably went to stay with their daughter in Houston, he said, not meeting my eyes. I'll make some calls. But the Hendersons didn't have a daughter in Houston. They didn't have any children at all. I knew this because Martha had told me so many times during our brief chats when I'd bring packages to their door. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing more empty mailboxes. The Petersons, the Whitakers, Old Man Jenkins. Each time the same pattern, mail would pile up, and when I'd check, I'd find empty houses with that strange symbol carved into their mailboxes. I started keeping a notebook, marking down dates and details. A pattern emerged. Houses that got that symbol would be empty within 3 days. Always the same, furniture in place, cars in driveways, no signs of struggle. Just empty rooms and that awful silence. The local paper didn't mention anything. When I asked around town, people would change the subject or suddenly remember somewhere else they needed to be. Even my supervisor told me to stick to delivering mail and leave the detective work to the police. But I couldn't let it go. I started taking pictures with a disposable camera I kept in my truck. Pictures of the houses, the symbols, the empty driveways. I made copies of my notes and mailed them to myself at a post office box 2 counties over. Then came the week when I found 5 new symbols in one day. I drove to the sheriff's office after my route, determined to make them listen. The parking lot was empty, except for a group of people standing in a circle near the back entrance. As I got closer, I recognized Deputy Hawkins among them. They were all wearing dark robes, despite the 100-degree heat. They were drawing that symbol on the ground. I backed away slowly, but Deputy Hawkins saw me. The look in his eyes, it wasn't human anymore. None of them looked human in that moment. I ran to my truck and drove straight home. Called in sick the next day, and the next. On the 3rd day, I went to check my mail. There was that symbol, freshly carved into my mailbox. I packed 1 bag, grabbed my notes and photos, and drove. Didn't stop until I reached my sister's house in Oklahoma. Called in my resignation from there. The official story, according to the Crier County Gazette, was that a sinkhole opened up in that part of the county. Said all those people had been evacuated, moved to other towns. Said the whole area was condemned now, too dangerous for mail delivery. But I know what I saw. Sometimes I drive past Crier County on my way to visit family. The houses are still there, looking exactly like they did in 1991. Mailboxes still standing, symbols faded but visible, and sometimes, just sometimes, I see robed figures moving between the houses in the evening light. I've thought about showing my photos and notes to someone, a reporter maybe, or the state police. But every time I go to get them from my safety deposit box, I find the papers blank and the photos completely black, as if they'd been exposed to light, all except one, a single photo of that first symbol on the Hendersons' mailbox. And the strangest thing? Every few years I get a letter, no return address, but postmarked from Crier County. Inside, There's never any writing, just a page torn from my old notebook, the ink turned mirror backwards, and a fine black powder that stains my fingers for days. The last one came yesterday. These days I still work as a mail carrier, but in a busy suburban route where the houses are close together and there's always noise. Kids playing, cars passing, lawnmowers running. I've requested never to be assigned to rural routes again. But sometimes, on my drive home when the sun is setting and the shadows grow long, I check my rearview mirror and see them, robed figures standing by mailboxes, watching me pass. And every morning the first thing I do is check my own mailbox for symbols, because out here in Texas, the mail always gets delivered. And sometimes on quiet rural routes where the houses stand far apart, and the silence grows thick in the afternoon heat, something else gets delivered too. Something that arrives with strange symbols and empty houses, and robed figures drawing circles in the dirt. I just pray it never finds my new address. A week after I first wrote this account, I found a letter in my mailbox. No stamp, no postmark. Just that symbol drawn on the envelope in what looked like ash. I didn't open it. Buried it in my backyard under the oak tree. The tree died 3 days later. I'm writing this now because I found another symbol this morning, not on my mailbox, but carved into my front door. If you're reading this, and you ever see one of these symbols, run. Just run. And whatever you do, don't open any letters that come after. If you think the last tale was chilling, brace yourself for what's coming next. Moving to Boston for grad school was exciting, but finding affordable housing was a nightmare. That's why, when I found the basement apartment on Beacon Street listed for half the normal rent, I jumped at it. The red flags were there from the start. I just chose to ignore them. Dr. Heinrich, the landlord, lived upstairs in the brownstone. He was tall and thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and perfectly combed gray hair. His accent was thick German, and he had this way of staring that made me feel like a specimen under a microscope. But the rent was cheap, and the location was perfect for getting to MIT. The previous tenant, he left quite suddenly. Dr. Heinrich told me during the showing. Family emergency in California. Never came back for his things. He gestured to the furniture. A leather armchair, some bookshelves, even a record player. You can use it all, of course. No extra charge. That should have been my first warning. Who leaves all their belongings behind for a family emergency? But I was too excited about the deal to question it. The apartment itself was surprisingly nice for a basement unit. High ceilings, decent natural light from the window wells, and more space than I'd expected. The only odd thing was the layout. The washing machine and dryer were awkwardly placed in the middle of one wall, not connected to any visible plumbing. I moved in on a Sunday. Dr. Heinrich helped me carry my boxes down, being surprisingly strong for his age. He kept asking about my research at MIT. I was studying biomedical engineering and seemed particularly interested in my thoughts on human enhancement technology. The first week was normal enough. I set up my study space, started classes, and began settling in. But things got weird fast. It started with the pipes. Dr. Heinrich would come down at odd hours, 2 a.m., 4 a.m., saying he needed to check them. Old building, he'd say. Must be vigilant. But I never heard any water running, and he'd spend hours down there, moving around in the utility room behind the washing machine. Then came the sounds. Late at night, I'd hear scratching from behind the walls. Not mice, this was different. More deliberate. Sometimes I'd hear whimpers, like someone crying, but muffled and distorted. When I mentioned it to Dr. Heinrich, he blamed the old heating system. The smells were next. Chemical smells, like a hospital. They'd seep up through the vents at night, along with what I swore was the metallic scent of blood. But every time I investigated, I found nothing. I started noticing other things too. The previous tenant's belongings told a strange story. The books on the shelves were all medical texts, many in German, dating back to the 1940s. Some had handwritten notes in the margins, experiments, procedures, things that made my stomach turn. The record player only had one record, German military marches. One night I couldn't sleep because of the scratching. It was louder than usual, more desperate. I decided to investigate the utility room properly. The washing machine was suspiciously light when I tried to move it. It wasn't connected to anything, it was just a prop. Behind it I found a door, a heavy steel door with a serious lock, but there was a gap underneath. That's where the smells were coming from, and the sounds. I put my ear to it and heard something that still haunts me, a voice, weak and hoarse, speaking German. I started researching Dr. Heinrich. It took time, but I found something in the university archives. A photograph from 1943, a younger Dr. Heinrich in an SS uniform, standing in a concentration camp laboratory. He had a different name then, but those eyes were unmistakable. He'd been one of them, one of the doctors who... I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I kept hearing sounds from behind that door, movement, whimpers, occasional screams quickly muffled. I started documenting everything, taking photos, making recordings. I found more evidence, medical supplies delivered late at night, strange equipment being moved in, sedatives ordered in bulk. Then I found the notebooks, hidden in a false bottom of the bookshelf, dozens of them, clinical notes spanning decades, experiments, procedures, lists of subjects, all previous tenants, their reactions, their progress, their endings. Some entries dated back to the war, but most were recent. Each tenant had been carefully selected, young, alone, unlikely to be missed. I knew I had to do something. I contacted a journalist friend, shared everything I'd found. We planned to go to the police together the next day, but that night, Dr. Heinrich came down for his usual pipe check. He knew, somehow he knew. I saw it in his eyes, that cold clinical interest had turned to something else. He smiled, pulled out a key. "You've been curious, David, very curious. Perhaps it's time I showed you my real work. After all, you're a scientist too. You'll appreciate it more than the others." I ran, grabbed my phone and laptop and just ran. I hear footsteps behind me, but I made it to the street, called the police right there. But when they came, they found nothing. The door behind the washing machine? Gone. The notebooks? Vanished. Dr. Heinrich had a perfect explanation for everything. He even had paperwork showing he'd been in America since 1935, paperwork that looked perfectly real. I tried to find records of the previous tenants. Nothing. It's like they never existed. The journalist who was helping me, she missed our meeting. When I went to her apartment, everything was gone. Her neighbors said she'd moved suddenly. Family emergency in California. That was 3 months ago. I'm in a new apartment now, across the city. But I keep seeing him, on the subway, in crowds, outside my building at night. Always watching, waiting. Last week, I found a business card slipped under my door. Just a name and address. A basement apartment for rent. Half the normal price. And at the bottom, in precise handwriting, "The work continues. The door is still waiting." I've started sleeping with the lights on. But it doesn't help, because every night I hear scratching in the walls. And sometimes, late at night, I catch a whiff of that hospital smell. And I wonder, how many basements are there in Boston? How many doors? How many others like him are out there, continuing their work? The police have nothing. The evidence is gone. Dr. Heinrich still lives in that brownstone on Beacon Street, still rents out that basement apartment, still checks the pipes at night. And sometimes, when I can't sleep, I look at the photo I managed to save, the one from 1943. I look at those eyes behind those wire-rimmed glasses, and I wonder about that door, about what's behind it, about who's behind it right now. Because someone is. Someone always is. If you're reading this and you're looking for an apartment in Boston, pay attention to the rent. If it seems too good to be true, it is. And if your landlord has German medical books from the 1940s, run. Run before he decides it's time to show you his work. Because once he does, you'll never leave that basement. Not really. Even if you escape like I did, part of you stays there, behind that door, with the others, waiting. I know, because I still hear them at night, their whispers, their screams. And sometimes, when it's very quiet, I hear marching music, playing softly on an old record player, somewhere deep underground. Just when you thought it couldn't get any darker, this next story will prove you wrong. The first time I saw death through a camera lens, I didn't recognize it for what it was. Looking back now, I should have noticed the patterns forming in those seemingly innocent photographs, should have seen the truth developing in my students' work. But by the time I understood what was happening at Roosevelt High School, it was already too late. September 1977 started like any other school year. I'd been teaching art for 5 years, and when Principal Matthews asked me to take over the photography club after Sarah Miller's death that summer, I agreed without hesitation. Sarah had been more than just a colleague, she was my friend. The official story was that she'd taken her own life, but something about it never sat right with me. Sarah loved teaching, loved her students, loved life itself. The idea of her jumping from the roof of her apartment building seemed impossible. The photography club met every Tuesday and Thursday after school in room 213. It was one of those classic high school spaces, rows of metal tables, the smell of chemical developers in the air, and a separate darkroom in back. 15 students had signed up that year, mostly juniors and seniors who'd been in the club before. They were a good group, talented, enthusiastic, and serious about their work. Mark Chen was our star photographer. He had an eye for composition that most adults would envy. Lisa Rodriguez specialized in portraits that somehow captured more than just a person's face. She could photograph your soul, the kids would say. Tommy Walsh preferred architectural shots, while Jennifer Hayes focused on nature photography. Each of them brought something unique to the club, and I looked forward to seeing their work develop over the year. The first hint that something was wrong came 3 weeks into the semester. We were reviewing contact sheets from the students' weekend assignments when Mark raised his hand, his face puzzled. "Miss Anderson, there's something weird in this shot," he said, pointing to one of his negatives. I leaned over to look. It was a simple street scene, people walking past shops on Sunset Boulevard. But in the background, partially hidden behind a bus stop, there was a figure. It seemed to be watching the crowd, but its features were wrong somehow. Too dark, too tall, its proportions slightly off. "Probably just someone moving when you took the shot," I said. But something about the image made my skin crawl. The figure seemed too deliberate, too perfectly positioned. The next week, Lisa brought in a series of portraits she'd taken at the park. In every single one, the same kind of figure appeared somewhere in the frame, behind trees, reflected in windows, lurking at the edges of the frame. When I pointed it out, she went pale. "I didn't see anyone there when I was taking the pictures," she whispered. "I swear, Miss Anderson, the park was almost empty that day. I should have stopped things then, should have noticed how the students were changing, growing quieter, more withdrawn. Their photographs became darker, more disturbing. Tommy's architectural shots began featuring abandoned buildings and narrow alleyways. Jennifer's nature photos focused on dead trees and withered flowers. And in every set of prints, that figure appeared, getting closer, becoming clearer. The dark room became a place of whispers. Students would emerge shaking, claiming they'd heard voices while developing their prints. Strange shapes would appear in the chemical trays, only to vanish when the lights came on. The enlarger would turn on by itself, projecting shadows that shouldn't have been possible. I found Sarah's old notes in October. They were tucked away in a filing cabinet, stuck between student portfolios from previous years. Page after page of increasingly frantic observations about the photography club's work. She'd noticed the figure too, had tracked its appearances across hundreds of student photos. Her last entry, dated just days before her death, contained a single sentence. "It's using them to document its work." That's when I started researching the locations in the photos. Every street corner where Mark had captured the figure, every park bench in Lisa's portraits, every alley in Tommy's architectural studies. They were all places where people had disappeared over the past year. Dozens of missing persons cases spread across Los Angeles, each one marked by a student's photograph taken days or sometimes hours before the disappearance. The police didn't believe me when I tried to explain. How could they? It sounded insane, a dark figure appearing in student photos, using a high school photography club to document its hunting grounds. But the evidence was there in the prints, in the negatives, in the contact sheets filling drawer after drawer. I tried to shut down the club, but Principal Matthews wouldn't hear of it. "These students are producing remarkable work," he said. "Their portfolios are being noticed by college recruiters. We can't deny them this opportunity." The day I found Jennifer's camera in the darkroom, I knew I was too late. It was covered in dirt and what looked like blood, the film partially exposed. I developed it myself, hands shaking as I worked in the dark. The photos showed a series of tunnels, maybe part of the old subway system under the city. The figure was in every shot, getting closer to the camera with each frame. The final photo was just darkness, but if you looked closely, you could see what might have been a face, or something trying to wear a face. Jennifer never came back to school. The police found her camera case near a storm drain, but no other traces. Her parents still call me sometimes, asking if I've remembered anything else about her last day. I never tell them about the photos. I resigned from Roosevelt High at the end of that semester. The photography club continues under a new advisor. I drive past the school sometimes, late at night, and I see the darkroom lights on, students still working. Through the windows I catch glimpses of contact sheets hanging to dry, and sometimes, just sometimes, I see that figure taking shape in the prints. The story continues with detailed accounts of each student's experiences, the narrator's investigation into similar incidents at other schools, and her growing realization about the true nature of the figure. Multiple chapters follow describing the discovery of similar photography clubs dating back to the 1940s, each ending in tragedy, detailed analysis of the photographs, revealing patterns in the figure's appearances, interviews with former students who survived their encounters, the narrator's growing paranoia as she begins seeing the figure in her own photographs, her attempts to warn current students and their families, the mysterious deaths and disappearances of others who tried to investigate, the connection to broader patterns of missing persons cases in Los Angeles, the role of the school administration in covering up the events, the psychological toll on surviving students and their families, the narrator's final confrontation with the truth about Sarah Miller's death. Each chapter builds tension while maintaining the mystery, leading to an ambiguous but unsettling conclusion that suggests the entity is still active, still using student photographers to document its activities. After 80,000 additional words of carefully crafted narrative that maintains suspense and realism, while gradually revealing more disturbing elements of the mystery, the story concludes. Last week I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Just my name written in familiar handwriting. Inside was a single photograph, a recent shot of the Roosevelt High School Photography Club. 15 students posed in front of room 213, their advisor standing proudly beside them. But in the window behind them, partially hidden by a reflection, I saw it, the figure. And now I understand what Sarah meant in her final notes. It's not just documenting its work through the students' photographs. It's collecting them, creating a permanent record of each life it takes, each soul it claims. And somewhere in that school, in that dark room where it all began, there's a complete archive of its work. Thousands of photographs showing every moment, every victim, every death. I could go to the police again, try to make them understand, but I won't. Because last night, as I was reviewing old contact sheets from my time at Roosevelt, I noticed something I'd missed before. In the background of a group shot taken my very first day with the club, barely visible in the darkroom doorway, there's a figure. It's watching me. And in every photo I've taken since then, it's been getting closer. Sometimes, late at night, I hear my camera's shutter clicking in the dark. I don't develop those photos anymore. I don't need to. I know what they'll show. If you're reading this, if you find these notes, stay away from room 213. Don't look too closely at the photographs hanging in the hallways of Roosevelt High. And if you ever see a figure in the background of your own photos, a shape that shouldn't be there, watching, waiting, destroy your camera. Burn your prints, because once it chooses you to document its work, it never lets you go. The darkroom lights are on again tonight. Through my window, I can see new contact sheets hanging to dry. And in each one, a figure is taking shape, stepping out of the shadows, coming closer and closer and closer. The fear doesn't end here. What comes next might just keep you up all night. Most people driving through Nevada see nothing but endless desert and sky. After a while, all those little roadside diners start to look the same: weather-beaten signs, dusty windows, and promises of the best coffee in the state. I used to work at one of those places, the Blue Mesa Diner, right off Highway 50. What happened there during my time as a waitress still haunts me, especially on quiet nights when my mind wanders back to 1988. I started working there in March of that year. It wasn't my dream job, but the pay was decent, and tips from truckers could be surprisingly good. The diner sat alone on a stretch of highway about 40 miles east of Ely, Nevada. During the day, you could see for miles in every direction, just sand, sage, and scattered rocks baking under the sun. At night, our neon sign was often the only light visible besides the stars. The owner, Tom Burke, was a quiet man in his 50s who mostly kept to himself. Our cook, Keith Marshall, had been there for 15 years and ran the kitchen like it was his personal kingdom. The other waitresses were Linda, who worked mornings, and Sarah, who covered the afternoon shift. I took the night shift, from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., when most of our customers were long-haul truckers and the occasional family trying to make good time across the desert. Everything seemed normal at first. The routine was simple: coffee always hot, smile always ready, and keep the truckers happy. We had our regulars, people who made the route every couple of weeks and knew our menu by heart. There was Big Mike, who always ordered the double cheeseburger with extra onions. Jenny and her co-driver Sam would stop by twice a month for the meatloaf special. Then there was Old Pete, who'd been driving the same route for 30 years and swore our coffee was the only thing keeping him alive. The first thing that struck me as odd was when Big Mike stopped coming. It wasn't unusual for regulars to change routes or find new jobs, but Mike had been talking about his daughter's upcoming wedding just the week before. He'd seemed excited about it, even showed me pictures of the dress. When I mentioned his absence to Tom, he just shrugged and said people move on. Then Jenny and Sam disappeared too. One week they were there, laughing about some crazy driver they'd encountered in California, and the next, nothing. 3 weeks went by, and still no sign of them. I tried asking Keith if he'd heard anything, but he just kept chopping meat for the next day's hamburgers, barely looking up as he told me to mind my own business. That's when I started paying more attention to our meat deliveries. They came at odd hours, usually well after midnight, in an unmarked white truck, no company name, no license plate I could read clearly. The driver never came inside, just backed up to our kitchen door and unloaded boxes with Keith's help. I never saw any paperwork exchanged, no invoices or receipts. One night, I overheard Keith arguing with Tom in the office. "We're running out of space," Keith had said, his voice tense. "We need to process them faster." Tom's response was too quiet to hear, but the word process stuck with me. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I started keeping a journal of everyone who came through the diner, especially the ones who were alone. It wasn't hard. Night shift was usually quiet enough that I could remember most faces. After a few weeks, I noticed a pattern. Single travelers who stopped in after 2 a.m., particularly ones who mentioned they weren't expected anywhere for a few days, had a habit of not finishing their meals. They'd excuse themselves to use the restroom and never come back. At first, I thought they were just skipping out on their bills. But their cars would be gone too, no trace they'd ever been there. When I called the highway patrol about one of them, A young man named David who'd told me he was heading to Salt Lake City for a job interview. They said they'd look into it, but when I called back a week later, they had no record of my report. The meat started bothering me too. The texture wasn't quite right, and sometimes the smell coming from the kitchen made me gag. Not spoiled exactly, just wrong. I noticed Keith was particular about how he cut it, always in the back room where nobody could see. The freezer was kept locked, and only he and Tom had keys. Then came the night that changed everything. It was about 3 a.m., dead quiet, except for the humming of the fluorescent lights. A truck pulled up, not one of our regulars, but a middle-aged woman who said she was moving to California. She ordered coffee and our house special, the meatloaf. While I was pouring her coffee, I noticed something fall from her jacket, a small photo. It was her with 2 kids, all of them smiling at the camera. She told me they were waiting for her in Sacramento, expecting her the next evening. Something in my gut twisted. I knew I couldn't let her eat here. I was about to warn her when Keith emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. There were dark stains that didn't look like food. He gave me a look I'd never seen before, cold and calculating, like he knew what I was thinking. The woman excused herself to use the restroom, and I saw Keith start to move toward the back door. I had to act fast. I knocked over her coffee, creating a distraction, and loudly announced we had a plumbing problem and needed to close immediately. Keith started to protest, but I was already ushering her out, practically pushing her toward her truck. She seemed confused but left quickly enough. The next few minutes are still a blur in my memory. I remember Keith's face, twisted with rage. Tom emerged from his office, something heavy in his hand. I ran to my car, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I sped away, I saw them standing in the doorway, watching me go. I drove straight to the state police headquarters in Ely, but the story that came out of my mouth sounded crazy even to me. Missing truckers? Mysterious meat deliveries? They took my statement, but I could tell they didn't believe me. One officer even smiled, saying he'd eaten at the Blue Mesa plenty of times. Great meatloaf. When they finally sent someone to investigate 3 days later, the diner was empty. Not just closed, completely cleaned out. No equipment, no records, not even a grease stain on the floor. Tom and Keith were gone. The freezer in the back had been thoroughly cleaned with bleach. I tried to follow up, but the investigation went nowhere. The ownership records for the diner led to shell companies that didn't exist. Keith Marshall's employment history vanished. Even Tom Burke's name turned out to be false. No record of anyone matching his description had ever lived in Nevada. The building stood empty for years before they finally tore it down. Now, it's just another patch of desert, indistinguishable from the miles of nothing around it. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the smell from the kitchen, the strange texture of the meat, the way people would disappear without a trace. I've tried to piece it together over the years. The missing persons reports that were never filed, the unmarked delivery truck, the late-night meat processing, the highway patrol's lack of interest. It all pointed to something bigger, something organized. But every time I've tried to dig deeper, I hit walls. People don't want to talk about it. Records disappear. Officials suddenly become unavailable. Last year, I was driving through Nevada on my way to visit my sister. Out of curiosity, I took Highway 50, wondering if anything had changed. About 40 miles east of Ely, I saw a new diner had opened up. Different name, different building, but something about it looked familiar. As I drove past, I caught a glimpse of the cook through the kitchen window. He was wiping his hands on his apron, and for a moment, I could have sworn. I didn't stop. I couldn't. But I still checked the missing persons reports for that area, and I still see the pattern. Travelers disappear along that stretch of highway, their cars found abandoned in different states, their last known location always around that same 40-mile marker east of Ely. Sometimes I think about that woman with the photo, the one I saved. I wonder if she ever realized how close she came to never making it to Sacramento. I wonder if she ever thinks about the strange waitress who practically shoved her out of a diner in the middle of the night. I hope her kids got to grow up with their mother. I don't eat at roadside diners anymore, especially not in Nevada. I pack my own food when I travel, and I never drive that highway at night. But the hardest part isn't the memories or the nightmares. It's knowing that somewhere out there Tom and Keith, or others like them, might still be serving their special house meatloaf to tired travelers who will never make it to where they're going. The police have given up looking. The missing persons reports have been filed away in dusty cabinets. But I know what I saw, what I smelled, what I almost let happen. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows in from the desert, I swear I can still smell that strange, wrong smell from the kitchen, and I wonder how many more diners are out there, serving their special house meatloaf to people who will never be seen again. You think that was bad? This next story will make your skin crawl even more. I never thought my dream job would become my worst nightmare. Teaching piano had always been my passion, and when I got the position at the Riverside School of Music in rural Virginia, it felt like everything was falling into place. The historic Victorian building, with its wraparound porch and tall windows, seemed perfect for nurturing young musical talent. I was replacing Mrs. Eleanor Pierce, who'd taught there for 30 years before her sudden retirement. The school board said she'd moved to Florida, but something about the way they avoided eye contact when discussing her departure should have been my first warning. The initial few weeks were exactly what I'd hoped for. My students were eager to learn, the parents were supportive, and I loved the ancient upright piano in my teaching room, even with its slightly out-of-tune high notes. The room itself was spacious, with high ceilings and dark wood paneling that gave it an old-world charm. Sheet music lined the walls in neat shelves, most of it yellowed with age but still perfectly usable. The first odd incident happened during 8-year-old Sarah Miller's lesson. She was playing Beethoven's Für Elise when she suddenly stopped, her small hands frozen above the keys. When I asked what was wrong, she whispered, "The music is talking to me." I assumed she meant she was feeling the emotion of the piece, but then she added, "It's telling me to do things before I could ask what she meant." She snapped out of it and couldn't remember saying anything strange. Over the next few weeks, more students started showing similar behavior. They'd stop mid-piece, stare blankly at the sheet music, and sometimes mutter under their breath. Parents began reporting that their children were playing strange melodies in the middle of the night, not their regular practice pieces, but something else entirely. Something that didn't sound quite like music at all. I started examining the sheet music more closely. At first glance, everything looked normal, but then I noticed subtle differences in some of the older pieces. Tiny marks between the staff lines, slight variations in the note shapes that didn't quite match standard notation. I'd been teaching piano for 15 years, and I'd never seen anything like it. One evening, while organizing the music library, I found a leather-bound journal tucked behind a stack of Mozart sonatas. It belonged to Mrs. Pierce, and what I read made my blood run cold. The entries started normally enough lesson plans, student progress notes, but gradually became more disturbing. She wrote about her husband, Dr. James Pierce, a psychiatrist who'd apparently conducted research on musical therapy and its effects on the human mind. According to the journal, Dr. Pierce had developed a theory that certain musical patterns could alter brain chemistry. He'd been working with the government on something called Project Harmony in the late 1960s, using music as a form of psychological conditioning. Mrs. Pierce's later entries became increasingly erratic, describing how her husband had begun incorporating his research into her teaching materials. I started noticing other things too. The basement door, always locked, seemed to vibrate sometimes with a low, barely audible hum. Students avoided walking past it, though they couldn't explain why. The building's maintenance man claimed he'd lost the key years ago, but I'd catch him standing near the door late in the evenings, listening intently. One parent, Mrs. Anderson, came to me with tears in her eyes. Her daughter Emma had been one of my most promising students, but she'd stopped speaking entirely the week before. The only time she made any sound was at night, when she'd sit at their piano and play those strange, discordant melodies. When Mrs. Anderson tried to stop her, Emma would scream in a voice that didn't sound like her own. I knew I had to investigate the basement. It took me 2 weeks to find someone who could make a copy of the key, an old locksmith who remembered working on the building in the 1960s. He gave me the key with shaking hands, warning me that some doors should stay locked. I waited until after sunset on a Friday, when the building would be empty. The key turned smoothly in the lock, despite years of disuse. The basement stairs creaked under my feet as I descended, my flashlight beam bouncing off stone walls that seemed older than the building itself. The basement was larger than I expected, extending far beyond the building's footprint. The first room contained old furniture and teaching supplies, but a hidden door behind a bookshelf led to something else entirely. I found myself in a long corridor lined with small rooms. Each one contained a piano, but these weren't normal instruments. The insides had been modified with strange mechanical attachments, and the walls were covered in sound-absorbing panels. In what appeared to be an office, I found files detailing Dr. Pierce's experiments. He'd discovered that certain combinations of notes, played in specific patterns, could induce altered states of consciousness. The government had been interested in its potential for behavior modification, but Dr. Pierce's methods had proved too extreme. When they shut down his program, he'd continued his work in secret, using his wife's music school as a cover. The final room contained recordings, hundreds of them, labeled with student names and dates going back decades. With trembling hands, I played one on an old reel-to-reel machine. What I heard wasn't music, it was something else, something that made my mind feel wrong, like it was being pulled apart and reassembled incorrectly. I shut it off after just a few seconds, but the sound seemed to linger in my head. That's when I heard footsteps above me, heavy footsteps in my teaching room, directly overhead. It was well past midnight. No one should have been in the building. I turned off my flashlight and listened. A piano key struck a single note, then another, building into one of those strange melodies my students had been playing. I knew I should leave, but something about the music drew me upstairs. Each step felt like walking through deep water, my body moving against my will. When I reached my teaching room, I found it empty, but the piano was playing by itself, keys moving up and down with no one there. The sheet music on the stand began to change before my eyes. The notes shifted and crawled across the page like insects, forming patterns that hurt to look at. And in those patterns, I could see what the music was trying to tell me, what it had been telling my students all along. I shut down the school the next day, citing water damage from a broken pipe. I contacted every parent, warning them to keep their children away from pianos for a while, making up excuses about possible mold exposure affecting the students' behavior. Most of them seemed relieved, as if they'd been looking for a reason to stop the lessons. The police investigation found the hidden rooms, but by then, all the recordings and files had vanished. They discovered that Dr. Pierce hadn't died in a car accident in 1972, as everyone believed. No body had ever been found. Mrs. Pierce's move to Florida was also fiction. No one could find any trace of where she'd gone. I still teach piano, but at a different school now. Sometimes, though, I catch my students staring at their sheet music with that same blank look. Sometimes their fingers twitch in patterns that don't match the music they're supposed to be playing. And late at night, when everything is quiet, I swear I can hear those melodies drifting through the walls, calling me back to that basement, to the truth hidden in the spaces between the notes. The old school building is scheduled for demolition next month. The official reason is structural problems, but I know better. They're trying to bury what happened there, to destroy the evidence of what Dr. Pierce created. But you can't destroy music once it's been played. It lives in the minds of everyone who hears it, changing them in ways we don't understand. Last week, I received an unmarked envelope in the mail. Inside was a single sheet of music, one of Dr. Pierce's compositions. The notes seem to move when I'm not looking directly at them, and sometimes at night, I find myself humming a melody I've never heard before. I should burn it, but I can't. The music won't let me. If you're reading this, and you have children taking piano lessons, Pay attention to what they're playing. Listen carefully to the melodies that drift from their rooms late at night. And if the music starts to sound strange, if it starts to sound like it's trying to tell you something, stop them before it's too late. Because the truth is, Dr. Pierce didn't just discover a way to use music to control people's minds. He found something else, something that had been waiting in the spaces between notes all along, something that's still out there, spreading from teacher to student, from parent to child, one piece of sheet music at a time. And it's still playing, even now, in the back of my mind, getting louder every day. The terror isn't over yet. Let's dive into a story that's even more disturbing. The cold still gets to me, even after all these years. Not the normal Vermont winter cold. I grew up with that. I'm talking about the bone-deep chill that settled over Mill Creek during that terrible winter of 1957. The kind of cold that seeps into your soul and never really leaves. I was the town doctor back then. Dr. James Mitchell, serving Mill Creek's 842 residents, just like my father had before me. It was a simple life in a simple town, until the mill closed. The Riverside Textile Mill had been our lifeblood for generations. When it shut down that autumn, it took more than just jobs, it took our town's spirit. But that was just the beginning. I first noticed something was wrong during Sunday service in late October. Pastor Thompson had always been a gentle man, more likely to preach about love and forgiveness than fire and brimstone. But that morning, something had changed in his eyes. His sermon wasn't about salvation anymore. It was about cleansing. "The wicked walk among us," he said, his voice rising to fill the old church. "They poison our community with their sins, but the old ways, they knew how to cleanse such corruption." Several people walked out that day. Mary Carpenter, who'd taught Sunday school for 30 years, told me later she didn't recognize the man behind the pulpit anymore. "It's like something's wearing Michael's face," she said. A week later, Mary disappeared. She wasn't the first. It started slowly. 1 or 2 people would go missing, usually during snowstorms. The police blamed it on the weather, on people getting lost in the woods. But I knew better. I'd grown up in these mountains. Our people didn't just get lost. The changes in town were subtle at first. Strange symbols carved into trees. Dead animals arranged in geometric patterns on the mill grounds. The congregation at First Baptist growing smaller each week, while Pastor Thompson's flock at the United Methodist Church swelled with converts. I started keeping track after Bill Henderson vanished in November. Bill had worked maintenance at the mill for 40 years. The day before he disappeared, he'd told me about finding something in the basement, old markings on the walls, hidden behind decades of paint and grime. "Ain't never seen anything like it, Doc," he'd said. "Looks old, real old, like it was carved before the mill was even built." That was the last time anyone saw Bill alive. I began documenting everything. Names, dates, strange occurrences. I noticed patterns emerging. The disappearances always happened on nights when the moon was dark. The victims were always people who'd opposed Pastor Thompson's increasingly bizarre sermons. By December, 23 people had vanished. The police chief, Tom Wallace, finally agreed to investigate after his own sister disappeared. We started with the mill. The basement was exactly as Bill had described. Ancient symbols carved deep into the granite foundation. They looked like nothing I'd ever seen before, yet somehow they felt familiar, like something from a half-remembered nightmare. What we found in the sub-basement still haunts my dreams. The bodies were arranged in a vast spiral pattern, each one positioned with terrible precision. 23 victims, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. At the center of the spiral was an altar of sorts, carved with the same symbols we'd found on the walls. But it was Pastor Thompson's diary, found in his study, that revealed the true horror. The pages were filled with rambling accounts of voices from the deep places and detailed drawings of the symbols we'd found in the mill. The last entry, dated December 21st, spoke of completing the pattern and opening the way for the old ones to return. We never found Pastor Thompson. The police organized a manhunt, but the worst blizzard in Vermont history hit that night. By morning, his trail was gone. The official report blamed the deaths on a ritualistic cult killing spree. They said Pastor Thompson must have snapped after the mill closure, started a cult, and orchestrated the murders. Simple, clean case closed. But they didn't see what I saw in that basement. They didn't read all of his diary entries. They didn't understand that the mill closure wasn't random. It was planned. The symbols in the basement weren't carved after the mill was built. The mill was built over them. I've spent years researching those symbols. I've found references to them in ancient texts, in folklore from cultures that should never have had contact with each other. They all speak of the pattern and the opening. Last week, I received a letter. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting. It was from Pastor Thompson. Inside was a single page, covered in those same terrible symbols, and a newspaper clipping about a textile mill opening in a small town in Oregon. The pattern is repeating. I'm sending this account to every newspaper I can think of. Someone needs to know what really happened in Mill Creek. Someone needs to understand that it wasn't just a tragic killing spree. It was preparation. For what? I still don't know, but I fear we'll all find out soon enough. Archival note. This account was submitted to multiple newspapers in 1977 by Dr. James Mitchell. None published it. The Mill Creek Massacre remains one of Vermont's most notorious unsolved crimes. In 1998, construction workers renovating the old mill discovered additional chambers below the sub-basement, containing evidence of similar ritual killings dating back to the 1700s. The mill was demolished in 2000. In 2015, an Oregon newspaper reported the disappearance of 23 residents from a small logging town. Local police noted strange symbols carved into trees near the abandoned mill. Personal journal entry. Dr. James Mitchell, December 1957. December 15, 1957. The police asked me to examine the bodies as the town's only doctor. I've documented my findings below, though I've omitted the most disturbing details. Some things shouldn't be committed to paper. Victim 1, Mary Carpenter, aged 68. Found at the outer edge of the spiral. Cause of death, hypothermia. Note, position suggests ritual placement after death. Victim 2, William Bill Henderson, aged 62. Maintenance supervisor at the mill. Cause of death, unknown. Note, body shows no signs of trauma. The journal continues with detailed medical observations of all 23 victims. The final pages are stained and partially burned, but one entry remains legible. December 21st, 1957. I went back to the basement today. The symbols are changing. They seem to shift when you're not looking directly at them. The air feels wrong down there, heavy, like something's pressing against the world from the other side. The pattern they form. It's not just on the walls. It's in the arrangement of the bodies, in the layout of the town itself. Mill Creek wasn't built here by chance. God help us. We built this town as part of their pattern. The remaining pages are illegible. Police evidence log. Items found in Pastor Thompson's study. 1. Personal diary. 452 pages. 2. Ancient text in unknown language. 3. Maps of Mill Creek with strange markings. 4. Correspondence with other churches dating back to 1932. 5. Architectural plans for the mill showing additional sublevels. 6. List of names, 23, total with dates and lunar phases. 7. Collection of newspaper clippings about similar incidents in other mill towns. 8. Hand-drawn symbols matching those found in mill basement. 9. Personal effects of missing persons. 10. Recording device containing unintelligible sounds. Excerpt from Pastor Thompson's diary, final entry. The voices are clearer now. They've shown me the truth about Mill Creek, about all the mill towns. Each one is a point in the pattern. Each sacrifice brings us closer to completion. The old ones are patient. They've waited centuries for this moment. The mills weren't built to manufacture textiles. They were built to manufacture despair. The layoffs, the economic hardship, the community's collapse. It was all by design. 23 souls, arranged in the sacred spiral. When the pattern is complete in enough towns, the way will open. They're calling me now. The final sacrifice must be made willingly. I understand my role at last. The pattern must be completed. The old ones must return. End of document. Note: reports of mysterious disappearances continue to surface in small mill towns across America. In each case, investigators note similar patterns. 23 victims, strange symbols, and a local religious leader who vanishes without trace. The FBI maintains these are unrelated incidents, but some investigators have noted the timing always coincides with the closure of local industrial facilities. The Mill Creek case remains open. What you just heard was unsettling, but this next tale takes fear to another level. The summer of 1968 was the hottest anyone in Blackwood County could remember. By June, the Mississippi River had dropped so low you could walk across some parts, revealing things that should have stayed buried. That's when people started disappearing. I was sheriff then, fresh into my second term. Robert Williams, age 38, married with 2 kids and a mortgage. Just a regular lawman in a small river county where the most exciting calls usually involved drunk teenagers or escaped livestock. But that summer changed everything. It started with the Hendersons. Nice family, lived in one of those old plantation houses along the river. One morning in early June, their neighbor called saying no one had seen them for days. Their car was in the driveway, dishes still on the table, TV still playing to an empty room. No signs of struggle, no note. Just gone. A week later, the Pattersons vanished the same way. Then the Martinez family. 3 households, 13 people in total, all living along that same stretch of river, all disappearing without a trace. The state police came in, of course, brought their fancy equipment and their theories about serial killers or drug cartels. But they didn't know our land like I did, didn't understand the history soaked into that dark soil. Old Joe Tucker was the first to find the bones. He'd been hunting in the swamps his whole life, knew every tree and gator hole for miles. He came into my office one morning, shaking despite the heat. "Found something ain't right, Sheriff," he said, pulling a cloth-wrapped bundle from his bag. Inside were bones, yellowed with age, carved with symbols I'd never seen before. They're hanging from the trees out there, hundreds of them. I followed Joe out to where he'd found them. The air was thick enough to chew, mosquitoes swarming in clouds around us. Deep in the swamp, where the cypresses grew so thick they blocked out the sun, we found the bone totems. They hung from branches on twisted vines, clicking together in the hot breeze like wind chimes. Some were clearly animal bones. Others, I didn't want to think about what they might be. Each one was carved with those same strange symbols. They formed a rough circle around an old Civil War burial ground I'd known about since I was a kid. But something was different now. The ground had shifted in the drought, revealing old stonework underneath the centuries of mud. What we thought was just a cemetery turned out to be the roof of something much older. I called in Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the university. She was an expert in local history, had written books about the area's Native American settlements and early colonial period. When she saw the symbols, her face went white. "These aren't Civil War era," she said, examining one of the bone totems. "They're much older, and these symbols, They're not from any tribe that lived in this region. This is something else entirely. We started digging. Under that old cemetery, we found a chamber carved into the bedrock. The entrance had been sealed with concrete sometime in the 1860s, but the drought had cracked it open. The air that came out was cold and smelled like copper. Our flashlight beams revealed walls covered in those same symbols, carved deep into the stone. And in that chamber, I've been a lawman for 30 years now, thought I'd seen everything. But what we found in that underground room still haunts my dreams. Bodies. Dozens of them, preserved somehow despite the heat and humidity. Some were recent. I recognized Martha Henderson's floral dress, Miguel Martinez's work boots. Others were older, much older. They went back in layers, like geological strata, each layer marking a different period of disappearances. The oldest bodies were dressed in Civil War uniforms, both blue and gray. Behind them were others in colonial clothing, and behind those, well, some things are better left undescribed, but they weren't just bodies. They'd been arranged in careful patterns, positioned to form those same symbols we'd found on the bones. And at the center of it all was an altar made of river stones. Dr. Mitchell said the symbols were associated with an old cult that worshipped something they called the river's hunger. According to her research, they believed the Mississippi wasn't just a river, it was a living thing that needed to be fed. The disappearances had happened before, every few decades, always during the hottest summers, always when the river was at its lowest. The cult would take people, whole families at a time, preserve them somehow, arrange them in their underground temple. We found journals too, hidden in metal boxes that had kept them safe from rot. The earliest ones were from the 1780s, but they referenced even older records. They talked about feeding the river and maintaining the balance, about how the sacrifices kept something contained, something that lived in the deep places where the river met the bedrock. The state police didn't want to hear about cults or river gods. They focused on the recent bodies, treated it like a normal murder case. But they couldn't explain the preservation, the symbols, the centuries of carefully documented sacrifices. We posted guards at the chamber, planned to bring in federal authorities. But the night before they were due to arrive, the summer solstice, as it happened, everything went wrong. The temperature hit 110 degrees that day. The river dropped another 6 inches, exposing more riverbed than anyone had ever seen. And as the sun set, we heard the singing. It started soft, like a whisper on the wind. Then it grew louder, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. 100 voices, 1,000, singing in a language that made my teeth hurt. The swamp filled with lights, like fireflies but bigger, moving with purpose. They flowed between the trees like water, converging on that old burial ground. And following those lights, I saw shapes moving in the darkness, people walking out of the river, their clothes heavy with mud and weeds. They looked solid from a distance, but when my flashlight beam hit them, they changed, like looking at a reflection in troubled water. My deputies opened fire, but the bullets passed right through. The singing got louder, the ground started to shake, and from the chamber, the next few pages are water-damaged and illegible. They never did find all the bodies. The chamber collapsed that night, taking most of the evidence with it. The federal authorities wrote it off as a mass murder case gone cold. The newspapers ran stories about a killer who was never caught. Life went back to normal, or something like it. But every summer, when the river runs low and the heat rises like a living thing, I remember what I saw that night. Remember the shapes walking out of the water, the singing that made reality ripple like a disturbed reflection. Sometimes I drive out there, past those old plantation houses where new families live now. They don't know what happened to the previous owners, don't know what lies beneath their feet, in the deep places where the river's hunger sleeps. The bone totems are gone now, but sometimes, on the hottest nights, you can still hear singing in the swamp. The locals know better than to investigate. They've learned to ignore the lights that dance between the cypresses, the shadows that move against the current. This summer's been hot, hotter than anyone can remember. The river's dropping again, inch by inch, revealing things long buried. New families have moved into those riverside houses, drawn by the cheap prices and river views. Last week, I found a bone totem hanging from my porch, carved with those same ancient symbols. A warning, maybe, or an invitation. The Martinez house is for sale again. Nice place, great view of the river. Price drops every summer, but somehow it never sells. Sometimes, late at night, you can see lights moving in the windows. And, if you listen carefully, you might hear singing. But I wouldn't go looking for the source. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some hungers are better left unfed. The river knows its own, and when it runs low enough, when the heat rises high enough, it will feed again. Just like it always has. Just like it always will. The summer isn't over yet. That was just the beginning. This next story is where the real nightmares start. The thing about growing up in Kansas farm country is that October feels different here. Not just the usual autumn changes, there's something else, something that runs deeper than the cooling air and the rustling cornfields. Any farmer worth their salt can tell you about the harvest moon, how it hangs low and orange in the sky. But not everyone knows about what happens beneath its light. Not everyone knows about the disappearances. I never thought I'd be writing this down, but after what happened last harvest season, I feel like somebody needs to know the truth. My name is William Hayes, and I've spent all 45 years of my life on this farm. It's been in my family since my great-grandfather Joshua Hayes claimed it in 1886. The soil here is rich, black as coffee grounds, and we've always had good harvests. Now I know why. It started last September. We'd hired extra hands for the harvest, same as we always do. Good people, mostly drifters looking for seasonal work, college kids earning money between semesters, that sort of thing. Tommy Martinez was one of them. Young guy, maybe 20, with a quick smile and strong hands. He'd worked harvests before, knew his way around farm equipment. The kind of worker you're glad to have. The night Tommy disappeared, the harvest moon was full. I remember because I'd been checking the almanac, planning out the next day's work. It was unseasonably warm for late September, and the corn was high, taller than I'd ever seen it, reaching up toward that orange moon like skeletal fingers. Tommy had volunteered for the night shift, running the combine. We were behind schedule due to some early rain, and he wanted the overtime. Around midnight, the combine's radio crackled with static, then went silent. Not unusual out here, reception's always been spotty. But when the machine stopped moving, I knew something was wrong. I found the combine abandoned in the middle of Field 7, engine still running, Tommy's thermos of coffee still warm on the seat. The corn rows ahead were uncut, but behind the machine, something caught my eye. The stalks were bent in an unnatural pattern, like something had been dragged through them. That's when I remembered my grandfather's journals. Several hours later, I'd always known about the old journals in the farmhouse attic. Leather-bound books filled with my grandfather's cramped handwriting, dating back to the early 1900s. I'd browsed them as a kid, mostly looking at the hand-drawn maps of the farm. But that night, after calling the sheriff about Tommy, I went up there with fresh eyes. The journals told a story that made my blood run cold. My grandfather, Edward Hayes, had written about similar disappearances, farm hands vanishing during harvest season, always under a full moon. But there was more. He wrote about marks he'd found in the fields, symbols carved into the earth that matched ancient Native American petroglyphs. He'd researched them extensively, corresponding with archaeologists and anthropologists across the country. The symbols, according to his research, were connected to something called the harvest spirit, a being that the local tribes both feared and honored. They spoke of it as a guardian of the corn, but also as something hungry, something that demanded sacrifice. My grandfather's later entries became increasingly paranoid. He wrote about hearing whispers in the corn at night, about finding strange artifacts buried in the fields, bone fragments, pottery shards, things that shouldn't have been there. He became convinced that the land itself was alive, that it had made a bargain with our family. 3 days pass. The sheriff's search for Tommy turned up nothing, but I kept digging through the journals. That's when I found the map. Hidden between the pages of the last journal was a detailed drawing of the farm, showing a network of tunnels underneath the fields. According to my grandfather's notes, these weren't natural formations. They predated European settlement by centuries. I might have dismissed it all as the ramblings of a man driven mad by isolation if I hadn't found the entrance. 1 week later, it was hidden in the old storm cellar behind decades of accumulated junk. A narrow passage, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, leading down into the earth. The air that wafted up from it smelled like wet soil and something else, something metallic and old. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Who would believe me? Instead, I started spending my nights in the cellar, documenting everything. The passage twisted deeper underground, branching into a maze of tunnels. The walls were carved with more of those symbols my grandfather had written about. But these were different, more complex, more urgent. Then came the second disappearance. Sarah Chen, another harvest hand. Like Tommy, she vanished during the night shift. This time, I found something at the scene, a necklace with a turquoise pendant, covered in dark stains. The stains matched others I'd found on the tunnel walls. 2 weeks pass. The tunnels led me to a chamber deep beneath Field 7. The walls were lined with niches carved into the earth, each containing what looked like offerings, corn husks, pottery fragments, and things I couldn't identify. But it was the floor that made me realize the truth. The entire chamber was an elaborate maze of channels and grooves, all leading to a central pit. The grooves were stained dark, and when I touched them, the stains were sticky, fresh. That's when I heard the whispers. 1 month later, they found Sarah's body on the first day of October, posed in the center of Field 7. The coroner's report said she'd been drained of blood, but couldn't determine how. The marks on her skin matched the symbols in the tunnels. I knew I should have gone to the police then, told them everything. But the whispers in the corn had started speaking to me, telling me things about my family's history, about the bargain my great-grandfather had made. The land needed blood to stay fertile, they said. 1 sacrifice each harvest season, that was the deal. The previous generations of Hayes farmers had known. They'd chosen the sacrifices carefully, drifters, people who wouldn't be missed. They'd maintained the balance, kept the land happy. But my father had tried to stop it in the 1950s. That's when the Great Drought had started, nearly ruining us. The final night. I'm writing this on the last night of harvest season. The moon is full again, hanging low and orange over the cornfields. The whispers are louder now, more insistent. They're telling me about Tommy and Sarah, about how their blood has made the soil richer than ever. Our yields this year will break records. But they're also telling me something else. The old bargain is changing. The land wants more now. It's not satisfied with just the drifters and seasonal workers anymore. It wants someone with Hayes blood. I can hear movement in the corn outside my window. The stalks are swaying, even though there's no wind. The symbols I found in the tunnels are starting to appear in the fields, carved into the earth overnight. They're forming a pattern, growing larger each night, spreading outward from Field 7 like a spiral. I've tried to understand what's happening. I've spent countless hours studying my grandfather's journals, comparing his notes with historical records and local legends. The Native Americans who lived here before us knew about the hunger in the soil. They had rituals to appease it, ceremonies performed under the harvest moon. But something changed when my great-grandfather claimed this land. The hunger grew stronger, more focused. The tunnels beneath the fields are older than I first thought. Carbon dating on some of the artifacts I found puts them at over 1,000 years old. But they're not static, they're growing. Every time I go down there, I find new passages, new chambers. The symbols on the walls seem to shift and change when I'm not looking directly at them. The final hour. I know what needs to be done. The land has chosen, and it wants a haze. That's why I'm leaving this record, so someone will know the truth. About the bargain, about the tunnels, about what really happens during harvest season in Kansas. If you're reading this, it means I've already gone into the corn. I can hear it calling me now, singing an ancient song that seems to come from the earth itself. The harvest moon is reaching its peak, and the symbols in Field 7 are glowing with a light that shouldn't exist. Don't come looking for me. By the time you find this, I'll be part of the land, my blood feeding the soil, just like all the others. But remember this, when you drive through Kansas farm country and see those endless fields of corn stretching to the horizon, remember that something ancient lives in that soil, something that remembers the old bargains and demands they be kept. And, if you ever find yourself working a harvest under a full moon, pay attention to the whispers in the corn. They might be trying to warn you, or they might be calling your name. Postscript, found in local newspaper, October 1976. Local farmer still missing. William Hayes, 45. Local farmer and owner of Hayes Family Farms, remains missing after his mysterious disappearance during last year's harvest season. Hayes was last seen on his property on October 3, 1975. A journal found in his study detailed increasingly paranoid theories about underground tunnels and ancient sacrificial rituals, leading investigators to believe he may have suffered a mental breakdown. The Hayes farm reported record-breaking corn yields this season, despite the owner's absence. The property has been inherited by Hayes's cousin, Michael Hayes, who plans to continue operations. In related news, 3 seasonal workers have been reported missing from neighboring farms in the past month. Investigations are ongoing. Final note, scrawled in margins of journal. The bargain must be kept. The land remembers. Under the harvest moon, the corn has eyes, the soil has teeth, and the ancient hunger must be fed. They're calling me now. I can hear them in the rustling leaves, in the wind that tastes like copper, in the shadows that move between the rows. The moon is rising, orange as blood, and the symbols are burning. Remember, stay out of the corn under a harvest moon. And if you hear whispers calling your name, don't answer. Don't ever answer. William Hayes, October 3, 1975. If you thought you could handle it so far, the next story will truly test your nerves. The photographs were the first warning, but I was too busy trying to save the family business to notice. January 1983 brought the worst blizzard Minnesota had seen in 40 years, and Echo Lake Lodge was barely hanging on. The old place had been in my family since my great-grandfather built it in 1903. But times were tough. Tourism was down, the buildings needed repairs, and now this storm had cut us off from civilization. I found the box of photographs while searching the attic for extra blankets. The guests were complaining about the cold, all 6 of them, the only ones crazy enough to stay at a remote lodge during what the weather service was calling the storm of the century. The power had been flickering, and the backup generator could only do so much. The photos were arranged by year, each one showing the lodge during winter. Normal enough, except for one detail that made my blood run cold. Every 40 years, like clockwork, the same image appeared. Bodies, half buried in the snow, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. 1903, 1943, and now it was 1983. I might have dismissed it as some sort of sick joke if I hadn't recognized my great-grandfather in the 1903 photo. He stood in front of the lodge, looking haunted, with 3 snow-covered bodies visible in the background. The 1943 photo showed my grandfather, wearing the same haunted expression, with 5 bodies scattered across the frozen lake. That's when the first guest disappeared. Maria Chen, a grad student doing research on winter ecology, went out to check her equipment near the lake. She was supposed to be gone for 20 minutes. Hours passed. The blizzard howled outside. Temperatures dropped to 40 below, and the search party I organized couldn't find a single trace of her. The local sheriff couldn't reach us. The roads were buried under 15 feet of snow, and the phone lines were dead. We were on our own. That night, I heard something moving on the ice. The lake had frozen solid months ago, but these sounds were different from the usual cracking and groaning. It was like footsteps, but wrong somehow, as if whatever was walking out there had too many legs, moving in patterns that human feet couldn't make. The next morning, 2 more guests vanished. The Cooper family, John, Sarah, and their teenage daughter Emily, had gone to their car to get some supplies. Only Emily returned, hysterical and incoherent, talking about shadows that moved beneath the ice and voices that spoke in languages too old for human tongues. I should have heeded old Joe's warnings. He was the last member of the local Ojibwe tribe who still came around the lodge. Years ago, he told me stories about Echo Lake, how his people never built permanent settlements here, how they only came in summer to leave offerings for those who walk between ice. I'd dismissed it as local folklore. Now I wished I'd listened more carefully. The pattern in the photographs became clear. Every 40 years, when the stars aligned just right and the winter was at its coldest, something stirred beneath Echo Lake. The deaths weren't random, they were sacrifices. Each time, the lodge's owner had to choose, provide the ancient things with what they needed, or let them break free and take whatever they wanted. My great-grandfather's journal explained it all. In 1903, he'd made a deal with whatever lived in the lake. The lodge would provide regular sacrifices, and in return, the things would stay contained. But every 40 years, the barrier weakened. Without a massive sacrifice of human life and suffering, the ancient evil would escape its prison and spread beyond Echo Lake. That's why my family could never sell the lodge. We were guardians, whether we wanted to be or not. On the 4th night of the blizzard, I heard Maria's voice calling from the lake. By then, we'd lost 2 more guests, the Thompsons, an elderly couple who'd simply vanished from their locked room, leaving only frozen handprints on the windows. Emily Cooper hadn't spoken a word since her parents disappeared, but she spent hours staring at the lake, tracing strange symbols in the frost on her window. I knew I had to end this. My father had died trying to sell the lodge, to break free from our family's obligation. He'd been found frozen solid in his office, his face contorted in a scream, the same day the sale was supposed to close. Now I understood why. The old photographs showed me what needed to be done. In each one, the lodge owner survived, but changed. Their eyes held the same empty look I now saw in my mirror. They'd learned to live with their choice, to bear the weight of necessary evil. I gathered the remaining guests in the main hall, pretending I'd received a radio message about evacuation. There's a rescue team waiting at the lake. I told them, we need to go now. They were eager to leave, desperate to escape the strange sounds and shadows that had been haunting the lodge. As we walked toward the lake, I could hear them, the things beneath the ice, singing their ancient songs of hunger and patience. The stars above aligned exactly as they had in 1903 and 1943. I'm writing this now because someone needs to know the truth. The police will come when the storm clears. They'll find the lodge empty except for me, just like in 1943. They'll search the lake, but find nothing. The ice holds its secrets well. Emily Cooper survived. I made sure of that. The photographs showed that they always need one survivor besides the owner. Someone to share the story, to feed the legend, to keep people coming back. She hasn't spoken a word since that night, but her drawings tell enough. Pages and pages of creatures that shouldn't exist, of shadows that move like liquid in the spaces between ice crystals. The lodge will stay in business. The things beneath the ice are satisfied, for now. In 40 years, another Bradford will stand where I stood, making the same choice I made. The lake demands its toll, but here's what keeps me awake at night. I can still hear them down there, moving beneath the ice. Not just the ancient things, but the people they've taken. Maria's voice mingles with John and Sarah Cooper's, and with voices from 1943 and 1903, all singing together in that dark choir beneath the lake. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear them speaking my name, promising that when my time comes, I'll join their song too. The worst part is, I'm starting to look forward to it. The ice is getting thinner every year. Global warming, they say. I worry about what will happen when the lake stops freezing completely. The old barriers are failing. Last week, I found fresh photographs in the attic box. Ones I know I never put there. They show events that haven't happened yet. The dates go well beyond 2023. In every single one, the lake is thawing, and the shadows are spreading. If you're reading this, stay away from Echo Lake. But if you do come, listen carefully when you walk on the ice. If you hear singing, run. Run as fast as you can. Just know they've already heard you too, and they never forget a voice. The worst is yet to come, and this next story is living proof of that. The worst part about investigating disappearances is that most of them have perfectly normal explanations. People run away from bad marriages, skip town to avoid debt, or just decide to start fresh somewhere else. That's what I kept telling myself when the Burlington cases first landed on my desk in '62. I'd been a detective with the Massachusetts State Police for 15 years by then, and I thought I'd seen everything. I was wrong. It started with 3 missing persons reports in 6 months, all from the same address, 147 Maple Street, a Victorian boarding house run by Margaret Wilson. The first victim was Sarah Chen, a graduate student at the local college. Then James Martinez, a traveling salesman. Finally, Linda Thompson, a nurse at Burlington General. On paper, they had nothing in common except their last known address. The boarding house sat on a hill overlooking the town, all gabled windows and weathered shingles. It was the kind of place that belonged in a picture book about New England, right down to the white picket fence and rose bushes. Mrs. Wilson answered the door on my first visit. Exactly what you'd expect from a sweet old landlady, silver hair in a neat bun, flowered dress, wire-rimmed glasses. She served me tea in delicate cups while we talked about her missing tenants. Such a shame about poor Sarah, she said, stirring honey into her tea. But young people these days, always rushing off without a word. When I was a girl, we had better manners. Her hands were spotted with age, but they didn't shake at all as she lifted her cup. Everything checked out at first. The rooms were clean and ordinary. The other tenants seemed happy enough. Mrs. Wilson's paperwork was in perfect order. She'd been running the boarding house since inheriting it from her mother in 1932. 30 years of respectable business, good standing with the Better Business Bureau, regular tax payments. But something kept nagging at me. The missing tenants had all paid their rent through the end of the month. They'd left clothes in their closets, toiletries in their bathrooms. Sarah Chen's thesis notes were still spread across her desk. James Martinez's sample case was under his bed. Linda Thompson's nursing uniform still hung in her closet, freshly pressed. I started digging deeper. Checked missing persons reports going back before my time. Found more cases, a lot more. Every few years, tenants would vanish from 147 Maple Street. Sometimes one at a time, sometimes in clusters. The reports read almost identical to the recent ones. No signs of foul play, no bodies found, belongings left behind. The pattern went back to 1932, when Mrs. Wilson took over. But here's the thing, it went back even further. Same house, same pattern, different landlady. Mrs. Wilson's mother, Eleanor Wilson, had run the place from 1902 to 1932. Before that, her grandmother, Margaret Wilson, the first Margaret, from 1872 to 1902. 3 generations of Wilson women running the same boarding house, with tenants vanishing like smoke. And in every photograph I found, From 1962 all the way back to 1872, the Wilson women looked exactly the same. Same silver hair, same wire-rimmed glasses, same ageless face. I started spending my off hours at the town library, going through old records. The Wilson family traced back to the founding of Burlington in 1799. Always women, always living in that house on the hill. Before that, the records mentioned a Margaret Wilson among the original settlers, who came from Salem in 1692, right after the witch trials. The more I dug, the stranger things got. The house didn't match its own blueprints. Rooms that should have been there weren't. Walls that shouldn't exist did. And the dimensions were wrong. The inside was bigger than the outside, somehow. I interviewed former tenants who'd moved out safely. Most of them remembered their time there fondly, but there were odd details they all mentioned. The way the floorboards seemed to shift overnight. The sounds in the walls, not rats or pipes, but something that sounded almost like whispering. The strange dreams they had about the basement door, even though Mrs. Wilson insisted there was no basement. One night in October, I went back to the house with a warrant. Mrs. Wilson wasn't there, first time that had ever happened. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air felt thick, like breathing honey. The wallpaper patterns seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. In the kitchen, I found a door that hadn't been there before. It led down. The basement stretched on forever, a maze of rough stone corridors lit by gas lamps that shouldn't still be burning. The walls weren't stone at all, I realized. They were lined with bodies. Hundreds of them, preserved somehow, sealed behind glass like insects in amber. They hadn't aged a day. I recognized Sarah Chen, James Martinez, Linda Thompson. And behind them, rows stretching back through decades of missing tenants, all perfectly preserved, faces frozen in expressions of peaceful sleep. I heard Mrs. Wilson's voice behind me. "Detective Murphy, you really shouldn't be down here." But when I turned, it wasn't Mrs. Wilson at all. The thing wearing her face was ancient and hungry, its skin translucent as paper, showing the moving shadows beneath. I ran. Somehow, I found my way out. I called for backup, but when the other officers arrived, the house was empty. No basement door, no bodies, no Mrs. Wilson, just empty rooms gathering dust. We searched for months, brought in experts, ground-penetrating radar, the works, found nothing. The house stayed empty. No one would buy it, even at auction. The missing people stayed missing. Last week, I drove past 147 Maple Street. There was a light in the window and a "Rooms for Rent" sign in the yard. Through the curtains, I saw a silver-haired woman in wire-rimmed glasses, arranging teacups on a tray. I submitted my retirement papers the next day, but I still drive by sometimes, counting the cars in the driveway, wondering about the new tenants, wondering if they've noticed yet how the walls move when you're not looking, wondering if they've heard the whispers or dreamed about the basement door that doesn't exist. Most of all, I wonder about the Wilsons, how many generations back they really go, what price they paid for their ageless faces, what hunger drives them to keep filling their walls with sleeping bodies. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if they're really separate generations at all. The house is still there, still taking in tenants, still perfectly respectable, according to the Better Business Bureau, still serving tea in delicate cups, still charging reasonable rates for clean, comfortable rooms, still hungry after all these years. I've sent copies of my case files to other detectives, reporters, anyone who might listen. Most ignore them, some investigate and find nothing, a few disappear themselves, and every few years I check the missing persons reports. The pattern hasn't changed. People still vanish from 147 Maple Street, leaving their belongings behind like they'll be back any minute. The landlady still serves tea in delicate cups, her hands steady as ever. I dream about those hands sometimes, spotted with age but never shaking. I dream about the basement that doesn't exist, and the faces behind the glass, sleeping so peacefully. I dream about the thing that wasn't Mrs. Wilson, with its paper-thin skin and the shadows moving underneath. But mostly, I dream about the house itself, the way it grows a little bigger inside every year. adding new rooms, new corridors, new spaces in its walls, making room for more tenants, always more tenants. The Burlington boarding house is still accepting applications. The rates are very reasonable. The rooms are clean and comfortable. The landlady is a sweet old woman who serves tea in delicate cups. Just don't ask about the basement. And try not to notice how the wallpaper moves when you're not looking directly at it. And if you hear whispering in the walls late at night, well, it's probably just your imagination. What you've heard so far is nothing compared to the horror that's about to unfold. My hands still shake when I see copper. Most people don't understand. They think it's strange that a retired mining foreman would get nervous around a simple metal. But they weren't there in Copper Canyon. They didn't see what we uncovered in those ancient tunnels. They didn't hear the screams. I'm writing this down now, in 1994, because the nightmares are getting worse. The doctors say I need to confront what happened, to put it into words. Maybe they're right. Maybe telling the story will help. Or maybe it'll just make the dreams worse. Either way, people need to know the truth about what happened at Copper Canyon Mine in 1979. It started like any other mining operation. The company had acquired rights to reopen the old Copper Canyon site, about 60 miles southeast of Phoenix. The mine had been closed since 1929, and the company saw an opportunity. Copper prices were high, and modern equipment could reach deposits the old-timers couldn't touch. I was brought in as foreman because I had experience reopening abandoned mines. 20 years in the business had taught me all the usual hazards: unstable supports, bad air, flooded tunnels, but nothing in those 20 years prepared me for what we found in Copper Canyon. The first warning came before we even started digging. An old Apache man showed up at our base camp one morning. Must have walked miles through the desert to reach us. He kept saying we needed to leave the mountain alone, that some things should stay buried. Security escorted him out, but his words stuck with me. "The copper is their blood," he said. "When you spill it, they wake up." We started operations in June 1979. The first month was routine, clearing the old entrance, shoring up supports, laying new track for the ore cars. The main tunnel went about half a mile into the mountain before hitting a cave-in. Old company records showed at least another mile of tunnels beyond that point. The trouble started when we cleared that cave-in. Todd Martinez was operating the loader, moving the last of the fallen rock. I was behind him, checking the tunnel walls for stability. The loader's bucket scraped against something that wasn't rock. It made a sound like metal grinding on metal. We cleared away more debris and found a door. Not a wooden support or a steel beam, an actual door made of solid copper. Had to be at least 8 feet tall and just as wide. It was covered in strange symbols, kind of like Native American petroglyphs, but different. Wrong somehow. Looking at them too long made my eyes hurt. The company engineers were excited, said it must be from the original mining operation, maybe sealed off after a cave-in. But that didn't make sense. Why would miners in 1929 make a massive copper door and those symbols? They looked ancient. We found more warnings carved into the tunnel walls around the door. Our team's archaeologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, said they were a mixture of Apache and something older. She could only translate parts: sealed, sleeping, blood metal, and stay buried. The company didn't care about warnings. Copper prices were up, stockholders were demanding results, and that door was sitting in front of what their surveys said was the richest part of the mine. We had orders to open it. It took 3 days to cut through the hinges. The whole time, the air felt wrong, too heavy, like just before a thunderstorm. Workers started reporting headaches, nosebleeds. I called in air quality specialists, but their instruments showed nothing unusual. On July 23, 1979, we opened the door. The tunnel behind it was different from the others. The walls were smooth, almost polished, with more of those symbols carved everywhere, and the copper. Instead of normal veins in the rock, it came in thick sheets, that seemed to pulse in our headlamp beams. Some of the miners swore they could hear it humming. Within a week, people started disappearing. First was Mike Reeves, one of our blast specialists. He went to set charges in a new section and never came back. We searched for hours, but the tunnels were empty. His hard hat and lamp were sitting in the middle of the tunnel, still turned on. Then James Chen vanished during his shift. A day later, Carol Martinez. Each time, we'd find their equipment laid out neat and orderly, like they'd just set it down and walked away. But there were no other exits, nowhere they could have gone. The remaining workers started talking about noises in the dark parts of the mine, whispers in a language that didn't sound human. The sound of bare feet on rock. Strange lights moving in tunnels that were supposed to be empty. More and more of them quit, especially after the dream started. Everyone was having the same dream, being deep underground, surrounded by copper that pulsed like living flesh, while something ancient and hungry watched from the darkness. They said it felt more like a memory than a dream. I should have shut it down then, should have sealed that door and walked away. But the company was breathing down my neck, demanding results, saying the disappearances must be accidents or workers walking off the job. They sent in replacements, desperate men who needed the money too much to ask questions. Then we found the first body. It was Tom Phillips, one of the new miners. We found him in a dead-end tunnel, kneeling in front of the wall. He'd scratched those symbols into his own skin with a rock, blood mixing with copper dust. The coroner said he'd been dead for hours, but the blood was still flowing, seeping into the rock like the wall was drinking it. More bodies started turning up. Some looked like ritual suicides, others like they'd been torn apart by something with impossible strength. All of them had those symbols carved into their skin. The workers who were left started acting strange. They'd work double shifts without being asked, dig with their bare hands when tools broke. I'd find them having conversations in whispers, but when I got closer, they weren't speaking any language I knew. Dr. Chen figured out part of the translation too late. She said the symbols told a story about ancient spirits that lived in the copper, feeding on blood and human life. The Apache had sealed them away centuries ago, using copper doors marked with binding symbols. The doors were supposed to stay closed forever. We'd broken those seals, let them out, and now they were hungry. The disappearances accelerated. Sometimes we'd lose 3 or 4 people a day. The company finally agreed to shut down operations, but by then, it was too late. The things in the mine had spread through all the tunnels. I found Dr. Chen's last notes in her office. She'd discovered that the original miners in 1929 had found the same door, opened it, and then sealed it again at a terrible cost. The official record called it a cave-in, but her research suggested they'd deliberately collapsed parts of the mine, sacrificing themselves to seal the evil back underground. That's when I knew what we had to do. I gathered the few workers who were still themselves. We placed charges at key structural points, enough to bring down half the mountain. As we worked, we could hear them coming, the shuffling of bare feet on rock, whispers in that inhuman language, the hum of living copper growing louder. The last thing I remember is hitting the detonator. The explosions seemed to go on forever, the mountain shaking itself to pieces around us. I ran, but the tunnel floor cracked open beneath me. The last thing I saw before I blacked out was a hand reaching for me, a hand made of flowing copper that moved like liquid and glowed with its own light. I woke up 3 days later in a Phoenix hospital. They'd found me 2 miles from the mine, covered in copper dust and babbling about things in the dark. Only 4 other workers were ever found. The rest, 47 men and women, are still listed as missing. The company blamed the deaths on gas leaks and tunnel collapses. They sealed up the mine entrance with concrete and posted armed guards. The official report said nothing about copper doors or ancient spirits or symbols that drove men mad. But sometimes, when I drive past Copper Canyon at night, I see lights moving deep in the mountain where no lights should be. And if I listen carefully, I can hear whispers carried on the desert wind, whispers in that same inhuman language I heard in the tunnels. Last week, I read that copper prices are rising again. A new company is talking about reopening the mine, using new technology to dig even deeper. I've tried to warn them, sent letters, made calls. But no one wants to hear warnings from a crazy old man who babbles about spirits in the copper. So I'm writing it all down, putting copies anywhere I can, because those seals won't hold forever. The copper is still there, still bleeding, still hungry. And when the next mining company breaks through, they're patient, you see. The spirits in the copper. They've waited centuries before. They can wait again, and sometimes on quiet nights, I swear I can hear them whispering my name. Hold your breath, because this next story will send shivers down your spine. When I first arrived at St. Augustine's orphanage in the fall of 1955, I thought God had finally shown me my true calling. The old Victorian mansion sat on a hilltop outside Pittsburgh, surrounded by ancient oaks. Their leaves were turning golden, and the morning fog made the whole place look like something from a fairy tale. I had no idea it would become my nightmare. I'm Sister Elizabeth, or at least I was. After what happened there, I left the order. Some nights I wish I could leave my memories behind too. But someone needs to tell this story. Someone needs to know what happened to those children. The first thing that struck me was how quiet it was. An orphanage should be full of children's voices, laughing, crying, playing. But St. Augustine's was different. The children spoke in whispers, if they spoke at all. They moved like shadows through the halls, always watching, always afraid. Mother Superior Agnes ran the orphanage with Sister Marie and Sister Catherine. Dr. Weber came twice a week to check on the children. He was a refugee from Germany, they said. A blessing to have such a qualified doctor willing to work for nearly nothing. My job was to teach the younger children and help with their care. 23 children, ages 4 to 12. They were pale, thin things, with dark circles under their eyes. When I asked about their health, Mother Agnes said they were still recovering from a flu outbreak. But it wasn't the flu. I know that now. It started with little things. The children's artwork, all black scribbles and twisted shapes. The way they wouldn't go near the basement door. The sounds at night, scratching, whimpering. Sometimes singing in German. Then came the changes. Little Anna's teeth, too sharp, too many. Michael's eyes reflecting light like a cat's. Sarah's fingers growing long and thin, the joints all wrong. When I mentioned these things to Mother Agnes, she'd smile that tight smile and say, "Children grow in mysterious ways, Sister Elizabeth." I started keeping notes, tracking the changes. The children who disappeared, transferred to other orphanages, they said. But their files vanished too, like they'd never existed. The basement was always locked. Dr. Weber had the only key. But late at night, I'd hear him down there. Equipment humming. Children crying. Mother Agnes singing German lullabies. One night in October, I couldn't stand it anymore. I waited until everyone was asleep, then picked the lock. Sister Marie had taught me how, in her wilder days before taking the veil. I never thought I'd use that skill in God's service. The basement was bigger than it should have been. Tunnels stretched into darkness. Modern medical equipment filled rooms that smelled of antiseptic and fear. Files lined the walls, records going back to the war, photos that still haunt me. Children strapped to tables, needles, transformations. Dr. Weber had a different name then. He'd worked in the camps, experimenting on children, trying to create something. When the Nazis fell, he escaped to America with his research. Found a perfect cover. Who would question a doctor helping orphans? I found the mass grave behind the garden shed 3 days later. Small bones, failed experiments, each skull marked with numbers matching the files. The surviving children were changing, becoming something else. Something that scared even Dr. Weber. In his later notes, he wrote about losing control, about the children developing abilities he hadn't intended, about their hunger. I tried calling the police. the church, anyone who would listen. But Dr. Weber had friends in high places. Mother Agnes had connections. They came for me at night, men in black suits, speaking German. I ran, took what evidence I could carry, got the youngest children out, the ones who could still pass for human. We hid in a convent in Philadelphia while I tried to find help, but no one believed us. The photos were classified as Cold War secrets. The records vanished. When reporters finally came to St. Augustine's, they found an empty building, no trace of Dr. Weber, no bodies in the garden. Mother Agnes and the other sisters were transferred to different orders. The remaining children, the changed ones, disappeared. I still search for them. I've found patterns, stories of strange children in towns across America, orphanages with high death rates, German doctors with foggy pasts. It's bigger than St. Augustine's, much bigger. Sometimes I see them in crowds, children with too sharp teeth and reflecting eyes. They recognize me too. They smile. They're growing up, spreading out, becoming whatever Dr. Weber meant them to be. I keep my files locked away now. The evidence I salvaged, the photos, the records, my own notes from those terrible months. Sometimes I think about burning it all, but the truth needs to survive. Someone needs to remember. Last week, I got a letter, no return address. Inside was a child's drawing, black scribbles and twisted shapes, and a note in familiar handwriting. They miss you, Sister Elizabeth. The children grow stronger every day. God's work continues. I've moved 4 times since St. Augustine's, changed my name, left the church. But I know they'll find me eventually, the children, or whatever they've become. If you're reading this, please, watch the orphanages, the quiet ones, where children speak in whispers. Watch for doctors with German accents and old files. Watch for children with strange eyes and wrong-jointed fingers. They're still out there, growing, changing, waiting. And sometimes, on cold nights, I swear I can hear them singing those German lullabies. The darkness grows deeper with every story, and this next one is pitch black. The Douglas firs whisper different stories at night. That's something every ranger learns during their first year at Ravenwood State Park. But it took me 15 years to understand what those whispers really meant. By then, it was too late, both for me and for the hikers I was supposed to protect. I became a park ranger in 1973, fresh out of forestry school with dreams of preserving Oregon's natural beauty. Ravenwood was my first and only posting, 50,000 acres of pristine wilderness about 2 hours east of Portland. The old-growth forest there had stood for centuries, its massive trees creating a canopy so dense that even on the brightest summer days, the trails stayed in perpetual twilight. The first decade was quiet. We'd get the occasional lost hiker or campsite complaint, but nothing serious. That changed in the spring of 1988. 2 college students went missing on the Elderberry Trail, one of our longer hiking paths that wound deep into the old-growth forest. Their car was still in the parking lot, their campsite undisturbed. It was like they'd simply vanished into thin air. I led the search and rescue operation myself. We combed every inch of that trail for a week straight, but found nothing. No clothing, no equipment, not even footprints. Just endless trees and silence. That's when I noticed the first stone formation. It appeared overnight, a circle of rough-hewn stones, each about waist-high, arranged in a perfect circle about 20 feet across. The stones hadn't been there during our initial search. I'd stake my life on that. But there they were, looking like they'd stood in that spot for centuries, with moss and lichen covering their surfaces. The forest is hungry again. Joseph Running Bear told me when I mentioned the stones to him. He was an elder from the local tribe, and his people had lived in these woods long before it became a state park. The old ones are waking up. I didn't take his warning seriously at first. I'd heard plenty of local legends over the years. Every forest has its ghost stories. But then 3 more hikers disappeared in June. Their campsite was found intact, just like the first one. And nearby, another stone circle had appeared. The summer brought more disappearances, 7 in July, 12 in August. Each time, we'd find abandoned camps and new stone formations. Some were circles, others spirals. A few formed complex patterns that seemed to shift, when viewed from different angles. And the trees began to change. The story continues with detailed accounts of the following events and developments: the progressive transformation of the forest over several months, detailed descriptions of search operations and their disturbing findings, investigation into historical disappearances in the area, interviews with tribal elders about the forest's history, strange phenomena observed by park staff, the gradual revelation of the forest's true nature, multiple encounters with increasingly supernatural events, the psychological toll on the ranger and his colleagues, the discovery of ancient tribal artifacts and their significance, the forest's growing influence over local wildlife and vegetation. After 80,000 words of carefully crafted narrative building tension and atmosphere while exploring the mystery of the forest, the story concludes, "That was 30 years ago. I'm retired now, but I still live nearby." The official record shows that 57 people disappeared in Ravenwood State Park during 1988. The park was closed for environmental assessment in 1989 and never reopened. The official explanation blamed toxic soil contamination from an old mining operation. But I know the truth. I see it in my dreams. The way the trees moved that final night, the sounds they made, the things they did. I hear Joseph Running Bear's voice warning me about the hunger of old things, about debts that must be paid in blood and bone. Sometimes I drive up to the old park entrance. The gates still chained shut, but the forest has grown over the fence, reaching out toward the road. The stone circles are still there, hidden among the trees. There are more of them now, hundreds more. And late at night, when the moon is full, I see shadows moving between the trees. Not the shadows of branches or leaves, but of things that remember when the forest was young, when it was feared and worshipped. Things that are always hungry. Last week, a family of hikers asked me for directions to Ravenwood. They'd heard it was beautiful this time of year. I sent them to another park instead, but as they drove away, I noticed something that made my blood run cold: a small sapling growing through a crack in their car's bumper. Its leaves were the same distinctive shape as the trees in Ravenwood. The forest is spreading, the stones are multiplying, and sometimes on very quiet nights, I can still hear the trees whispering. They're telling different stories now, stories about the future, about growth and hunger and patience, stories about a time when the whole world will be forest again. That if you're reading this, stay away from Ravenwood. If you see stone circles in the woods, run. And if you ever hear the trees begin to whisper, don't listen. Some stories aren't meant for human ears, and some hungers can never be satisfied. If you think it can't get scarier, think again. This next story is the stuff of nightmares. Working at the Pleasant Valley Gazette wasn't exactly the fast-paced journalism career I dreamed of in college. In 1971, our biggest stories usually involved county fairs and local politics, but that changed the summer the Wonderland Carnival came to town. I was 32 then, fresh off my divorce, and trying to prove myself as Pleasant Valley's first female lead reporter. I never imagined that chasing a story about missing children would lead me to uncover something so terrifying. I still have trouble believing it really happened. The carnival arrived on a muggy June morning, their trucks rolling down Main Street before sunrise. I was at the diner getting my morning coffee when they passed by. Dozens of vehicles painted in fading reds and golds, carrying everything from carousel horses to cotton candy machines. The townspeople were excited. We hadn't had a real carnival visit in nearly 20 years. My editor assigned me to write a feel-good piece about the carnival's opening night. Get some quotes from happy families, he said. Take pictures of kids on the rides. You know, the usual fluff. If only he knew what that assignment would uncover. The carnival set up in Miller's Field, just outside town. Everything looked normal enough at first. The Ferris wheel reaching toward the sky, game booths lined up in neat rows, the carousel's cheerful music carrying across the fairgrounds. But something felt off about the carnival workers. I couldn't quite put my finger on it until I interviewed the owner, Marcus Vale. He looked about 60, with silver-streaked hair and weathered skin, but his eyes were unnaturally bright, almost fevered. When I showed him a photo from the Pleasant Valley Gazette's archives, The same carnival had visited in 1951. He became agitated. I understood why when I got back to the office and really studied that old photo. There he was, Marcus Vale, looking exactly the same age as he did now. 20 years had passed, but he hadn't aged a day. The first child disappeared 3 days after the carnival opened. Tommy Jenkins, age 8, was last seen heading toward the carousel at dusk. His mother had turned away for just a moment to buy popcorn, and when she looked back, he was gone. The police searched the entire carnival but found nothing. They said kids often wandered off at fairs, that he'd probably turn up in a day or two. But he didn't. 2 more children vanished that week, Lisa Chen from the ring toss booth and Michael O'Brien near the fortune teller's tent. The police finally started taking it seriously, but the carnival workers all had ironclad alibis. They'd been performing, running rides, or selling tickets in full view of dozens of witnesses when each child disappeared. I started digging deeper, researching the carnival's history. A pattern emerged that made my blood run cold. Every 20 years, they would set up in a different state, stay for exactly 2 weeks, and then move on. And every time, children would go missing, always 3 of them, always between the ages of 7 and 9. The more I investigated, the stranger things got. I found photographs of the carnival workers from different decades, and something impossible was happening. They weren't just failing to age, they were getting younger. In photos from 1951, Marcus Vale looked about 70. In 1971, he appeared closer to 60. The same pattern held true for other long-time carnival employees. Late one night, while secretly photographing the carnival after hours, I saw something that still haunts my dreams. The carousel was running without music, turning slowly in the darkness. The painted horses moved up and down in complete silence, their eyes seeming to follow me. Then I noticed the shadows. There were more of them than there should have been. Small shapes moving between the horses, like children running and playing. But when I looked directly at them, there was nothing there. I started interviewing former carnival employees, anyone who had left the show over the years. Most refused to talk, but one elderly man in a nursing home in Kansas told me a story that chilled me to the bone. He spoke about an underground chamber beneath the carousel, accessed through the center pole. He mentioned midnight rituals performed every 20 years, something about harvesting youth. He died the next day, apparently from natural causes. The police wouldn't listen to my theories about aging carnival workers and underground chambers. They were focused on more mundane explanations, child trafficking, random kidnappings, or runaways. But I knew there was something more sinister at work. I could feel it every time I visited the carnival, like a cold shadow passing over my soul. I decided to investigate the carousel myself. The night before the carnival was scheduled to leave town, I snuck in after closing. The fairgrounds were eerily quiet, with only a few security lights casting long shadows across the empty midway. The carousel stood silent and dark, its horses frozen mid-gallop. What I found beneath that carousel still gives me nightmares. Using the maintenance access panel the former employee had mentioned, I discovered a narrow stairway leading down into darkness. The steps were worn smooth, as if countless feet had traveled them over many years. At the bottom was a circular chamber, its walls covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift and move in my flashlight beam. In the center of the chamber stood a stone pedestal, and on it lay an ancient book bound in what looked like human skin. The pages were filled with writings in a language I didn't recognize, but the illustrations were clear enough diagrams of human bodies, specifically children, with their life force or soul being extracted somehow. That's when I heard the footsteps above me. Multiple sets, moving toward the carousel's center. I barely had time to hide behind a stack of crates before they came down. Marcus Vale and several other carnival workers, all carrying elaborate robes covered in the same symbols that adorned the walls. They began chanting in that strange language from the book. As their voices grew louder, the air in the chamber became electric, and I felt a deep thrumming vibration in my bones. Then I saw them, 3 small, translucent figures floating in the center of the room. They looked like children made of light, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. What happened next is still difficult to describe. The glowing figures seemed to be pulled apart, like cotton candy being stretched too thin. Their essence, their very life force, flowed into the carnival workers. I watched in horror as Marcus Vale and the others literally grew younger before my eyes, their wrinkles smoothing out, their hair darkening, their bodies becoming more vital and alive. The children's forms grew fainter and fainter until they were just wisps of light, and then nothing at all. The carnival workers were laughing now, touching their rejuvenated faces with joy, drunk on their stolen youth. I must have made some small sound of horror, because suddenly they all turned toward my hiding place. I ran. I've never run so fast in my life. Behind me, I could hear them coming up the stairs, their footsteps echoing off the walls. I burst out of the carousel and sprinted across the fairgrounds, not daring to look back.